Hey everyone, tonight we journey into one of history's most compelling mysteries, a story that connects the ancient sands of Mesopotamia to the timeless monuments along the Nile, a narrative about beings who walked among humans long before recorded history began. Before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what we explore here together, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It always fascinates me to see who joins us on these journeys through time. Dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that gentle background hum, and let's ease into tonight's exploration together. We're about to examine ancient texts that suggest our civilizations may have been founded not by primitive humans struggling toward enlightenment, but by mysterious beings of extraordinary knowledge and power. The Sumerians called them Apkallis. The Hebrews knew them as watchers. The Egyptians revered them as Neteru and Shemsu-Hor. Different names, different languages, but perhaps the same enigmatic entities who shaped human destiny in ways we're only beginning to understand. Long before the first pharaohs raised pyramids toward the sky, before the first cuneiform wedges pressed meaning into wet clay, there existed a time shrouded in myth and mystery. Ancient texts from multiple civilizations speak of this era with remarkable consistency, describing rulers who were not quite human, beings who possessed knowledge far beyond what primitive societies should have commanded. These weren't the gods of later pantheons, distant and aloof. These were entities who walked among humans, taught them, guided them, and according to some traditions, corrupted them. The story begins in Sumer, the cradle of civilization, where humanity first learned to write, to build cities, to organize complex societies. But the Sumerians themselves insisted they hadn't invented these things. They claimed these arts came from 7 wise beings who emerged from the waters of the Persian Gulf, creatures described as having the bodies of fish and the heads of men. These Apkallis, as they were called, served the god Enki and brought the gifts of civilization to humanity during an age before the Great Flood swept the ancient world clean. Move westward along the ancient trade routes, past the great rivers and the fertile crescents, and you reach Egypt, land of pyramids and mysteries that continue to baffle modern engineers. The ancient Egyptians also spoke of a golden age before the dynasties began, when divine beings called Neteru walked the earth. They described the Shemsu-Hor, the followers of Horus, semi-divine rulers who possessed astronomical knowledge, architectural genius, and spiritual wisdom that would be passed down through carefully guarded lineages of priests and initiates. These parallel traditions from Sumer and Egypt present a tantalizing possibility. Were they describing the same beings? Were the Apkallis and the Shemsu-Hor different cultural memories of identical entities? And if so, what does that tell us about the true origins of human civilization? The answers lie buried in ancient texts that scholars have been piecing together for centuries, texts that speak of beings who defied the boundaries between heaven and earth, who took human form and human lovers, and whose legacy would echo through millennia. The Book of Enoch, an ancient Jewish text that didn't make it into the biblical canon, but was revered by early Christians and is still considered scripture by the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, provides perhaps the most detailed account of these mysterious beings. It tells of 200 angels called Watchers, who descended to Mount Hermon in the days before Noah's flood. Their leader, Semjaza, feared undertaking this transgression alone, so they swore an oath together, binding themselves to their decision. They looked upon the daughters of men and found them beautiful, and they took them as wives. From these unions came the Nephilim, giants of terrible power and insatiable appetites. The text describes these offspring as creatures 300 cubits tall, though scholars debate whether this represents literal height or symbolic magnitude. These giants consumed all the produce of humanity, and when that was exhausted they turned to devouring humans themselves, then animals, and finally each other. But the corruption didn't end with their monstrous appetites. The Watchers themselves began teaching humanity secrets that were meant to remain hidden. Azazel, one of the chief Watchers, taught men the arts of war, how to forge swords and shields and breastplates, how to turn peaceful farmers into warriors. He taught women the arts of adornment, cosmetics and jewellery, the beautification of the eyelids, the working of precious metals and stones. Other watchers taught the cutting of roots and plants for magical purposes, taught astrology and the reading of signs in the heavens, taught enchantments and sorcery, taught how to observe the stars and interpret their movements. Knowledge that should have been revealed gradually, naturally, was instead dumped upon an unprepared humanity. This forbidden knowledge didn't enlighten humanity, it corrupted them. Wars multiplied as weapons became more sophisticated. Vanity and lust grew as cosmetics enhanced beauty. The natural order was violated as humans peered into mysteries they weren't ready to comprehend. The earth filled with violence and wickedness, with bloodshed and corruption, until God decided that the only remedy was to cleanse the world through flood, to start again with righteous Noah and his family, to give humanity another chance. But here's where the story becomes more intriguing. The Book of Enoch wasn't written in a vacuum. It emerged from a cultural context that was deeply influenced by Mesopotamian traditions, by stories and myths that had been circulating in the ancient Near East for thousands of years. And when we examine those Mesopotamian sources, we find striking parallels that suggest the Enochian narrative might have been drawing from much older traditions preserved in the cuneiform tablets of Sumer and Babylon. The Sumerian king list, one of the most fascinating documents from the ancient world, records the rulers of Sumer from the beginning of kingship. But unlike typical king lists that record mortal rulers and their accomplishments, this document begins with kings who reigned before the Great Flood, antediluvian monarchs whose reigns are measured not in years, but in tens of thousands of years. Alulim of Eridu, the first king, supposedly ruled for 28,800 years. His successor, Alalgar, reigned for 36,000 years. These aren't normal human lifespans. They speak of something else entirely. Modern scholars usually dismiss these numbers as mythological or symbolic attempts by later Sumerians to glorify their ancient past. But what if the numbers represent something different? What if they're recording not the reign of individual kings but the duration of dynasties, or the rule of beings who existed on a different timescale than mortal humans? The Sumerian texts themselves provide a clue. They state that kingship descended from heaven, that it was lowered to earth by the gods. This wasn't metaphorical. The Sumerians believed their first rulers were literally divine or semi-divine beings. Each of these antediluvian kings had a sage, an Apkallu, who served as his counselor. These 7 sages were sent by the god Ea, also known as Enki, the lord of wisdom and the sweet waters beneath the earth. The texts describe these Apkallis as hybrid creatures, part human and part fish, though later traditions sometimes depicted them with bird heads or purely human forms. They emerge from the Apsu, the primordial waters of chaos that existed before creation, bringing with them the knowledge and skills necessary for civilization. The first Apkallu was Uwana, also called Adapa, and he was said to have completed the plans for heaven and earth. He taught humanity how to read and write, how to do mathematics, how to build cities and temples, how to establish laws and divide land, how to plant seeds and harvest crops. In other words, he gave humans everything they needed to transform from primitive hunter-gatherers into sophisticated city dwellers. The second sage, Huanaduga, was endowed with comprehensive intelligence. The third, Enmaduga, was allotted a good fate. Each of the 7 possessed specific attributes and taught specific arts. These Apkallis weren't just teachers. They were also magicians and exorcists, practitioners of the sacred arts that blurred the line between science and sorcery. They understood the movements of the stars, could read omens in the flight of birds, knew how to purify temples and drive out evil spirits, could interpret dreams and predict the future. Their knowledge was comprehensive, covering every aspect of what it meant to be civilized, from agriculture to architecture, from mathematics to medicine, from writing to warfare. The parallels to the Watchers of Enoch are unmistakable. Both groups consist of supernatural beings who descend to earth. Both teach humanity forbidden or advanced knowledge. Both are associated with the antediluvian period, the time before the Great Flood. Both are connected to the corruption that necessitated the flood's cleansing. The main difference is in the moral framework. The Book of Enoch presents the Watchers as rebels and transgressors whose teaching corrupted humanity. The Sumerian texts present the Apkallis more ambiguously, as both culture bringers and potentially dangerous beings who had to be carefully controlled. This ambiguity is important because it reveals something crucial. The Mesopotamian tradition itself wasn't entirely positive about the Apkallis. In some texts, they're associated with demons and evil spirits. They're counted among dangerous beings capable of witchcraft and malevolent magic. They're described as creatures who must be bound and controlled lest they wreak havoc. In the Epic of Era, when the god Marduk inquires about them, he asks, "Where are the 7 sages of the Apsu, the pure Puradu fish, who just as their lord Enki have been endowed with sublime wisdom?" The implication is that they're no longer readily available, that something has happened to remove them from their counseling roles. This darker aspect of the Apkallu tradition provides the foundation for the Jewish transformation of these figures into the evil watchers. The Book of Enoch and related texts took existing Mesopotamian traditions about antediluvian sages and inverted them, turning cultural heroes into villains, transforming wise teachers into corruptors. Or perhaps they didn't invert anything. Perhaps they simply emphasized an aspect of the tradition that was already present, a recognition that these beings, however wise and knowledgeable, represented a dangerous blurring of boundaries between the divine and human realms. The connection between Mesopotamian and Jewish traditions is well established. The Jews were exiled to Babylon in the 6th century before the Common Era, where they encountered Mesopotamian myths and incorporated them into their own religious literature. The biblical flood narrative, for instance, shows clear influence from the much older Mesopotamian flood stories, like the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Atrahasis epic. It would be strange if they hadn't also adapted Mesopotamian traditions about the antediluvian sages. But what about Egypt? How does the land of pharaohs fit into this narrative? The answer requires us to examine Egyptian traditions about their own origins, their own accounts of how civilization began. And when we do, we find yet another parallel set of traditions describing divine or semi-divine rulers who preceded the historical dynasties, beings who possessed extraordinary knowledge and who established the foundations of Egyptian civilization. The ancient Egyptians had a concept they called Zep Tepi, the first time, a golden age when the gods walked upon the earth. This wasn't the distant mythological past of creation. It was a specific historical period, according to Egyptian belief, when divine beings established the patterns and principles that would govern Egyptian civilization for millennia. During this first time, the god Ptah established the sacred sites. The god Thoth invented writing and mathematics. The god Ra travelled across the sky in his solar bark, and other members of the pantheon took physical form to interact directly with the land and its inhabitants. These gods were called the Neteru, a word that means something more complex than our modern term gods. It translates more accurately as guardians or watchers, beings who maintained cosmic order and protected sacred knowledge. The similarity to the Hebrew term for watchers is not coincidental. Both derive from roots meaning to watch, to guard, to keep vigil. The Neteru were not distant abstractions, they were active presences, beings who could manifest in various forms, who walked among humans and shaped the destiny of Egypt. The pyramid texts, inscribed inside the pyramids of the Old Kingdom and among the oldest religious writings in the world, speak of these divine rulers. They describe a time when the boundaries between heaven and earth were permeable, when gods and humans interacted freely, when knowledge flowed directly from divine sources to human recipients. But they also make clear that this age eventually ended. The gods withdrew. They returned to the sky, to the stars, leaving behind only their teachings and the monuments they had helped construct. Before they departed, however, they established a lineage of semi-divine rulers to maintain their legacy. These were the Shemsu-Hor, the followers of Horus, or as some scholars translate it, the companions of Horus. Egyptian king lists like the Turin Papyrus and references in the works of the Egyptian priest Manetho speak of a period when these semi-divine beings ruled Egypt for thousands of years after the gods themselves had departed but before the first mortal pharaoh took the throne. The Turin Papyrus, despite being fragmentary and damaged, preserves a tantalizing glimpse of this tradition. After listing the historical pharaohs, it goes backward in time, recording earlier rulers who were increasingly removed from normal human parameters. First come the dynasties we recognize from history, then come rulers with suspiciously long reigns, then come the Shemsu-Hor, who ruled for 6,000 years according to the surviving portions of the text, and before them come the Neteru themselves, the gods who ruled for even longer, periods. Manetho, writing in the 3rd century before the Common Era under the patronage of Ptolemy II, had access to temple records that are now lost. His Egyptiaca, a history of Egypt, survives only in fragments quoted by later writers, but these fragments preserve his chronology. After the historical dynasties, Manetho lists a period ruled by spirits and demigods, the Shemsu-Hor. Before them, he places the reign of the gods themselves. He provides dates and durations, treating this mythical period with the same seriousness he applies to historical dynasties. Modern Egyptologists, like their colleagues studying Mesopotamia, typically dismiss these pre-dynastic rulers as mythology, as the ancient Egyptians projecting their contemporary kingship back into an imagined golden age. But the Egyptians themselves insisted these traditions were historical. Temple inscriptions, pyramid texts, and religious literature all refer to the time of the gods and the followers of Horus as actual periods in Egyptian history, not as symbolic or metaphorical constructs. The Shemsu-Hor were more than just rulers. They were keepers of sacred knowledge, initiates into the mysteries that the Neteru had established. They understood the principles of sacred geometry that governed the construction of temples and pyramids. They knew the astronomical alignments that connected earthly structures to celestial patterns. They possessed the wisdom to maintain cosmic order through proper ritual and correct understanding. They were, in essence, the links between the age of the gods and the age of humans. Later Egyptian traditions associated the Shemsu-Hor with the construction of the great monuments that still stand at Giza and elsewhere. Some scholars have interpreted certain texts to suggest that the Great Sphinx, that enigmatic monument whose true age remains debated, might date back to this era of the Shemsu-Hor, making it far older than conventional Egyptology accepts. The evidence is circumstantial and controversial, but it points to a consistent Egyptian belief that their most impressive monuments were not the work of the historical pharaohs who claimed them, but were instead inheritances from a much earlier age. The indigenous oral traditions of Egypt, preserved by families who claim unbroken lineages extending back thousands of years, tell a different story about the Shemsu-Hor than mainstream Egyptology accepts. According to these traditions, the term doesn't mean followers of Horus in a devotional sense. Instead, Horus originally meant the realized man, an enlightened individual who had achieved a higher state of consciousness. The Shemsu-Hor, then, were the people of the realized man, a community of advanced beings who had developed exceptional mental and spiritual capabilities. This interpretation, promoted by indigenous wisdom keepers like Abdelhakim Aoyan, suggests that before the concept became associated with kingship and political power, it represented a spiritual achievement. These were individuals who had mastered themselves, who had activated latent capabilities within human consciousness, who had become, in effect, more than ordinarily human. They established the foundations of Egyptian civilization not through divine intervention from outside, but through the application of advanced human potential that most people never access. Whether we interpret them as divine beings, as semi-divine intermediaries, or as highly advanced humans, the Shemsu-Hor represent a critical link in Egyptian tradition between the age of the gods and the age of mortal pharaohs. They bridge the gap, preserve the knowledge, maintain the traditions, and their existence creates a parallel structure to what we find in Mesopotamia, where the Apkallis served similar functions, connecting divine wisdom to human civilization. The question naturally arises, were the Shemsu-Hor and the Apkallis connected? Did they represent the same tradition expressed in different cultural contexts? Or were they entirely separate phenomena that happened to follow similar patterns? To answer this, we need to examine the historical connections between Sumer and Egypt, the trade routes, and cultural exchanges that linked these two foundational civilizations. The distance between Sumer and Egypt is significant, but not insurmountable for ancient travelers. Trade goods moved between Mesopotamia and the Nile Valley from very early periods. We find Mesopotamian cylinder seals in Egyptian contexts and Egyptian artifacts in Mesopotamian sites. The two civilizations were aware of each other and engaged in both direct and indirect exchange. Ideas traveled along with trade goods. Religious concepts, mythological narratives, artistic styles, and technical knowledge all flowed along the ancient trade networks. More intriguingly, both civilizations show evidence of sudden advancement around the same historical period. The Sumerian civilization appears seemingly fully formed in southern Mesopotamia around 3300 before the Common Era, complete with writing, complex cities, sophisticated agriculture, and advanced craftsmanship. There's minimal evidence of gradual development. It's as if the Sumerians arrived on the scene already civilized. Similarly, Egyptian civilization coalesces remarkably quickly around 3,000 years before the Common Era, with writing, monumental architecture, complex administration, and sophisticated art appearing in a relatively short time frame. This parallel timing has led some researchers to propose that both civilizations were seeded by a common source. Whether we want to call that source the Watchers, the Apkallis, the Neteru, or something else entirely, the theory suggests that knowledge bearers, whoever they were, established multiple centers of civilization around the same time, giving humanity the tools needed to organize large-scale societies. These knowledge bearers would eventually be remembered as gods or demigods or semi-divine sages, but they might have been something else altogether. Let's examine the specific parallels more closely. Both the Mesopotamian Apkallis and the Egyptian Shemsu-Hor are described as possessing comprehensive knowledge. Both are associated with the antediluvian or pre-dynastic periods. Both are credited with teaching humanity the fundamental arts of civilization. Both are sometimes depicted as hybrid creatures or as beings who could take different forms. Both are connected to water symbolism. The Apkallis emerged from the Apsu, the subterranean freshwater ocean. The Shemsu-Hor were associated with the Nile and its life-giving floods. Both traditions preserve the memory of a catastrophe that ended their direct rule. In Mesopotamia, it's the Great Flood. In Egypt, while there's no comparable flood narrative in the surviving texts, there are references to catastrophes and upheavals that mark transitions between ages. Both traditions suggest that after the departure or destruction of the divine rulers, human civilization had to maintain itself using knowledge passed down from those earlier times. Knowledge that was always in danger of being lost or corrupted. The seven Apkallis find a potential parallel in Egyptian tradition as well. The Egyptians had concepts of 7 wise ones, though these aren't as clearly defined in surviving texts as the Mesopotamian sages. The number 7 itself carries symbolic weight across many ancient traditions. 7 days in the week, 7 classical planets, 7 notes in the musical scale. The recurrence of this number in traditions about antediluvian or pre-dynastic sages might reflect an actual historical memory or might represent symbolic completeness. One of the most intriguing connections involves the god Thoth, the Egyptian deity of wisdom, writing, mathematics, and magic. In later Greek tradition, he was identified with Hermes Trismegistus, Hermes the thrice great, the legendary founder of Hermeticism and alchemy. Thoth was said to have been the inventor of writing, the measurer of time, the recorder of the deeds of the gods, and the teacher of humanity. His role closely parallels that of the Mesopotamian god Enki, who sent forth the Apkallis to civilize humanity. Some esoteric traditions identify Thoth not as a god but as one of the Shemsu Hor, an enlightened being who achieved such mastery that he was later deified. They suggest he might have been the Egyptian equivalent of Adapa Wana, the first Apkallu. This identification remains speculative and isn't supported by mainstream scholarship, but it points to ways in which ancient wisdom traditions tried to reconcile different cultural narratives into a coherent whole, to find the common thread running through diverse mythologies. The famous polymath Imhotep, architect of the step pyramid at Saqqara, and later deified as a god of medicine and wisdom, was in later traditions associated with the Shemsu Hor. Some claimed he possessed knowledge that came down from the time of the gods, that he had access to ancient wisdom preserved in secret libraries and hidden chambers. Whether or not he was actually connected to pre-dynastic sages, the tradition indicates that the Egyptians themselves believed such connections were possible, that knowledge from the time of the Shemsu Hor could be accessed by particularly wise or initiated individuals. This brings us to another important aspect of both the Apkallu and Shemsu Hor traditions. Both were associated with secret or hidden knowledge, with wisdom that was not meant for everyone, with mysteries that required initiation and preparation to understand. The Mesopotamian sages were exorcists and magicians, practitioners of arts that required special training. The Egyptian followers of Horus were initiates into temple mysteries, keepers of sacred knowledge passed down through carefully controlled lineages. This emphasis on secret knowledge reflects a common concern in ancient societies. Not all wisdom was meant to be public. Some knowledge was dangerous if misused or misunderstood. Some truths required spiritual and moral preparation before they could be safely comprehended. The traditions about the Watchers in the Book of Enoch make this explicit. The knowledge they taught to unprepared humanity led to corruption and violence. It wasn't the knowledge itself that was evil, but the premature revelation of that knowledge to people who weren't ready for it. The Book of Enoch goes into considerable detail about what the Watchers taught. Azazel taught metallurgy, the working of metals for weapons and ornaments. Semjaza taught enchantments and root cutting, the use of plants for magical purposes. Amaros taught the resolving of enchantments. Barakijal taught astrology. Kokabel taught the constellations. Ezekiel taught the knowledge of the clouds. Arakiel taught the signs of the earth. Shamsiel taught the signs of the sun. Sariel taught the course of the moon. Each Watcher specialized in particular knowledge, and together they gave humanity a comprehensive education in arts, both beneficial and dangerous. In Mesopotamian tradition, each Apkallu also had specializations. The first, Uwana Adapa, was the sage of Enki who completed the plans for heaven and earth. The second, Uwana Duga, was endowed with comprehensive intelligence. The third, Enmeduga, was allotted good fate. The fourth, Enmegalama, was born in a house. The fifth, Enmebuluga, grew up on pasture land. The sixth, Anenlilda, was the conjurer of the city of Eridu. The seventh, Utuabzu, ascended to heaven. Each had specific attributes and roles in the divine plan. What exactly did these sages teach? Sumerian texts credit them with bringing the me to humanity. The me were divine principles or decrees that governed all aspects of existence, from the physical laws of nature to the social structures of civilization, from the arts and crafts to the rituals and ceremonies that maintained cosmic order. The Apkallis were the mediators who brought these principles from the divine realm to the human world, making civilization possible. They taught the art of writing, transforming spoken language into visible symbols that could preserve knowledge across time. They taught mathematics, the ability to count and measure and calculate, essential for architecture, astronomy, and commerce. They taught agriculture, the cultivation of crops and the irrigation of fields, transforming humans from nomadic hunter-gatherers into settled farmers. They taught architecture, the construction of buildings from simple shelters to elaborate temples, creating permanent structures that defied time. They taught metallurgy, the extraction of metals from ore and their working into tools and weapons, advancing humanity from the Stone Age into the Bronze Age. They taught astronomy, the observation of celestial bodies and the calculation of their movements, enabling the creation of calendars and the prediction of seasons. They taught medicine, the understanding of the body and the treatment of disease, reducing suffering and extending life. They taught law, the codification of rules and the administration of justice, making large-scale societies possible. But they also taught things that might be considered more problematic. They taught astrology, the belief that celestial movements influence human affairs, blurring the line between science and superstition. They taught magic and divination, methods of manipulating spiritual forces and predicting the future, practices that later religions would condemn. They taught the arts of war, making humans more efficient at killing each other. They taught cosmetics and ornamentation, potentially encouraging vanity and desire. The question becomes, was all this knowledge beneficial or harmful? The Mesopotamian tradition is ambivalent. The Apkallis brought civilization, but civilization has its discontents. Cities require governments, governments require hierarchies, hierarchies create inequality. Writing preserves knowledge but also enables propaganda and false records. Mathematics enables architecture but also taxation and accounting for tribute. Metallurgy creates tools but also weapons. The gifts of the Apkallis were mixed blessings. The Book of Enoch takes a darker view. The knowledge the Watchers taught led directly to corruption. Weapons led to warfare. Cosmetics led to lust. Astrology and magic led to spiritual corruption. The text sees the entire episode as a transgression, a violation of divine order. Knowledge was given before humanity was ready for it, and the results were catastrophic. Only the cleansing of the flood could reset the world and give humanity another chance, this time without the corrupting influence of the Watchers. But let's consider another possibility. What if the Watchers, the Apkallis, and the Shemsu-Hor weren't supernatural beings at all? What if they were simply very advanced humans from an earlier civilization that was destroyed, possibly by the same catastrophe remembered as the Great Flood in multiple traditions? What if the attributes ascribed to them, their longevity, their wisdom, their hybrid nature, were attempts by later, less advanced peoples to explain capabilities they couldn't understand? This theory has been developed by various alternative historians and researchers. They point to evidence of catastrophic climate change around 11,600 years ago, at the end of the last ice age, when massive flooding reshaped coastlines worldwide. They suggest that an advanced civilization existed before this catastrophe, that it was destroyed or severely damaged, and that survivors scattered across the world, bringing their knowledge to surviving populations who had been less advanced. These knowledge bearers would have seemed godlike to the people they encountered. They would have possessed technologies and understanding that appeared magical. They would have known writing when everyone else was illiterate, mathematics when everyone else counted on fingers, astronomy when everyone else saw only lights in the sky. Over generations, as they died, and their knowledge was imperfectly transmitted, they would have been transformed in memory from human teachers into divine beings, from flesh and blood into myth and legend. This interpretation doesn't require us to believe in supernatural intervention. It only requires us to acknowledge that human history might extend further back than conventional archaeology accepts, that there might have been rises and falls of civilization that aren't reflected in the archaeological record, that catastrophic events might have destroyed evidence that would change our understanding of the past. The survivors of such a lost civilization, carrying knowledge salvaged from their destroyed world, would match the descriptions of the Apkallis and Shemsu-Hor remarkably well. Evidence for such a lost civilization remains controversial and disputed. Proponents point to megalithic structures around the world that show remarkable similarities in construction, despite being separated by vast distances. They point to geological evidence of catastrophic flooding at the end of the last ice age. They point to myths and legends from dozens of cultures that describe advanced beings who brought civilization after a great catastrophe. They point to anomalies in the archaeological record, structures or artifacts that seem too sophisticated for their supposed age. Mainstream archaeology remains skeptical, arguing that the evidence is better explained by conventional theories of gradual human development. They point out that similar techniques can be independently invented, that myths are often symbolic rather than historical, that dating anomalies usually have mundane explanations. The debate continues, with neither side able to definitively prove their case, hampered by the simple fact that much potential evidence would have been destroyed by the same catastrophe that supposedly ended the earlier civilization. But whether we interpret the Watchers, Apkallis and Shemsuhor as supernatural beings, advanced humans, or symbolic representations of cultural development, the traditions themselves remain remarkably consistent. Something significant happened in the ancient past. Knowledge was transmitted to humanity. Civilization began, seemingly quite suddenly in historical terms, and that transmission was remembered across cultures as the work of special beings who stood between the divine and human realms. The role of the Great Flood in these traditions deserves closer examination. In Mesopotamian tradition, the flood marks a clear break. Before the flood, the Apkallis ruled alongside divine kings. After the flood, human kings ruled with the council of human sages called a Manu, who were trained in the wisdom traditions the Apkallis had established, but who lacked their supernatural attributes. The Sumerian king list explicitly states that the flood swept over the land, and after it, kingship descended from heaven again, but this time to mortal rulers. The Epic of Gilgamesh, Sumer's greatest literary achievement, deals extensively with the flood and its survivor. Utnapishtim, the Mesopotamian Noah, tells Gilgamesh about the catastrophe, describing how the gods decided to destroy humanity, how the god Ea warned him to build a boat, how he gathered his family and representatives of all living creatures, how the flood waters rose and covered the earth, how finally the waters receded and he made sacrifice to the gods. The gods, smelling the sweet savour and realizing they had nearly destroyed all humanity, granted Utnapishtim and his wife immortality. Gilgamesh seeks out Utnapishtim precisely because he wants to learn the secret of eternal life. The flood survivor is one of the few mortals ever granted immortality, and Gilgamesh, facing the death of his friend Enkidu and terrified by his own mortality, believes Utnapishtim can teach him how to escape death. But the secret, it turns out, is not something that can be taught or replicated. Utnapishtim received immortality as a unique gift from the gods. Gilgamesh cannot achieve it through knowledge or effort. Interestingly, the epic connects Gilgamesh himself to the pre-flood world. It states that he obtained knowledge from before the flood, that he understood the totality of wisdom about all things, that he explored everywhere and knew the entirety of history. How did a post-flood king gain pre-flood knowledge? The text suggests he learned it from the antediluvian sages, that despite the catastrophe, some of their wisdom survived and could be accessed by those who sought it diligently. In the Book of Enoch, the flood serves a specific purpose. It's God's method of cleansing the earth from the corruption introduced by the Watchers and their giant offspring. The Nephilim cannot be allowed to continue. They consume everything, destroy everything, corrupt everything. The Watchers themselves must be punished for their transgression. So God commands the archangels to bind the Watchers in the valleys of the earth until the day of judgment, and to use the giants' own violence against each other, causing them to destroy themselves before the floodwaters complete the job. The text is quite specific about the fate of the Nephilim. Their bodies are destroyed by the flood, but their spirits, being hybrid creatures that are neither fully heavenly nor fully earthly, cannot simply die. Instead, they become the evil spirits that plague humanity in the post-flood world. This explains, in Enochian theology, why demons exist. They're the disembodied souls of the Nephilim, angry, hungry, seeking to possess and corrupt the descendants of the humanity their fathers once dominated. This theological innovation provides Judaism and later Christianity with an origin story for demons that's more elaborate than anything in the canonical Hebrew Bible. It explains why evil spirits exist, where they came from, why they're hostile to humanity. It ties together the brief Genesis passage about the sons of God and the daughters of men with a comprehensive narrative of pre-flood corruption, divine judgment, and ongoing spiritual warfare in the post-flood world. Egyptian tradition lacks a comparable flood narrative in its surviving texts, which is peculiar given how widespread flood myths are across cultures. The Nile flooded regularly, of course, in annual cycles that were predictable and generally beneficial, depositing nutrient-rich silt that made Egyptian agriculture incredibly productive. But there's no Egyptian equivalent to the Mesopotamian or biblical accounts of a catastrophic deluge that destroyed the world. This absence has puzzled scholars for generations. Some researchers suggest the Egyptian flood tradition was lost when the religion was suppressed and replaced by Christianity and later Islam. Others argue that Egypt's geographical situation made it less vulnerable to catastrophic flooding than Mesopotamia, so the Egyptians didn't develop flood mythology. Still others propose that Egyptian tradition did preserve flood memories, but in different symbolic forms, perhaps in stories about the chaos waters of Nun from which creation emerged, or in narratives about cosmic battles between order and chaos. However, Egyptian tradition does preserve the memory of a transition between the age of divine rule and the age of mortal pharaohs. The Shemsu-Hor served as intermediaries during this transition. When the Neteru departed, returning to the sky or becoming purely spiritual entities, the Shemsu-Hor maintained civilization using the knowledge the gods had imparted. They were the keepers of the flame, ensuring that the wisdom of the first time wasn't lost even as direct divine presence faded from the land. Eventually, even the Shemsu-Hor passed away or departed, or transformed into something less tangible. The historical pharaohs who followed claimed legitimacy by presenting themselves as successors to this divine lineage. Each pharaoh was considered the earthly embodiment of Horus, the divine son who avenged his father Osiris and claimed the throne of Egypt. In this way, the pharaohs maintained a connection, however attenuated, to the original divine rulers. They weren't gods themselves exactly, but they were God-touched, divinely appointed, bridges between heaven and earth. The coronation rituals of Egyptian pharaohs included elements that symbolically reenacted the transfer of power from the gods to humans. The pharaoh wasn't simply crowned by human priests, he was mystically united with Horus, becoming Horus incarnate for the duration of his reign. When he died, he became Osiris, and his son became the new Horus. This perpetual cycle maintained the link to the divine origins of kingship, keeping alive the memory of when gods and semi-divine beings had actually ruled Egypt in physical form. Similar patterns appear in Mesopotamian kingship. After the flood, according to tradition, kingship descended from heaven again, but the new kings were explicitly mortal. They still ruled with divine sanction, still performed rituals that connected them to the gods, still claimed to speak with divine authority. But they weren't themselves divine or semi-divine. They were human administrators of a cosmic order that had been established in the antediluvian age, but now had to be maintained by mortal effort. The transition from divine rule to human rule, from the age of the Watchers to the age of ordinary humanity, represents a fall from a golden age. Multiple traditions preserve this sense of decline. The Greeks had their ages of man, declining from a golden age when gods and humans mingled freely, through Silver and Bronze Ages to the Iron Age of conflict and toil. Hindu tradition speaks of the Yugas, world ages that decline from the Satya Yuga when Dharma was perfect, through 3 lesser ages to the current Kali Yuga of darkness and confusion. This pattern of decline from a better past appears across cultures and continents. It might reflect genuine historical memory of a time when life was easier, climate more favourable, knowledge more abundant. Or it might be a universal human tendency to romanticize the past and project current problems backwards as recent developments. Probably it's some combination of both. Times change, knowledge is lost as well as gained, and humans inevitably remember a golden age before the troubles of the present. The importance of these traditions about the Watchers, Apkallis and Shemsu-Hor, lies not in determining whether they were literally true, but in understanding what they reveal about how ancient peoples understood their own origins. They saw themselves as inheritors of wisdom from an earlier age. They believed their civilizations had been established by beings greater than themselves. They preserved, in myth and ritual and sacred text, memories or constructs of a time when the boundaries between divine and human were more permeable. These traditions shaped how they viewed knowledge itself. Wisdom wasn't something humans invented through trial and error, figuring things out from scratch. It was revelation, gift, inheritance from teachers who possessed superior understanding. This meant knowledge was precious, fragile, always in danger of being lost or corrupted. It had to be carefully preserved, protected, transmitted through proper channels to qualified recipients who had demonstrated their worthiness through initiation and discipline. Understanding this ancient perspective on knowledge helps us appreciate why education in the ancient world took the forms it did. In Egypt, becoming a scribe required years of rigorous training. Students began by copying text repeatedly, memorizing not just content but the exact forms of hieroglyphs, the proper ways of expressing ideas. They learned mathematics through practical problems about measuring fields and calculating grain stores. They studied the movements of stars to maintain the calendar that governed agricultural cycles and religious festivals. All of this was understood as learning wisdom that had come down from the time of Thoth, from the age when gods walked the earth and taught humans directly. In Mesopotamia, scribal education similarly emphasized preservation of traditional knowledge. The Aduba, the tablet house where scribes were trained, operated under strict discipline. Students spent years learning to form cuneiform signs properly, copying literary texts, memorizing mathematical tables, practicing divination formulas. The curriculum included Sumerian language itself, which by the second millennium before the Common Era was no longer spoken but was preserved as the sacred language of scholarship and religion, much as Latin functioned in medieval Europe. The knowledge these students learned was understood as having descended from the Apkallis. Mathematical techniques for surveying fields, astronomical methods for tracking time, medical treatments for various ailments, all were gifts from the 7 sages of Eridu. To be educated meant to participate in a tradition stretching back to the antediluvian age, to access wisdom that had been preserved through the catastrophe of the flood because righteous scholars maintained it. This view of knowledge as inherited rather than invented created both stability and rigidity in ancient intellectual culture. On one hand, it meant that hard-won understanding wasn't lost with each generation. Techniques and formulas were carefully transmitted, ensuring continuity. On the other hand, it discouraged innovation. If the Apkallis had already revealed everything humanity needed to know, what was the point of trying to discover new things? The role of the scholar was to preserve and interpret, not to innovate. Yet innovation did occur, of course. New mathematical techniques were developed, astronomical observations became more sophisticated, medical knowledge expanded, engineering advanced. But these innovations were often framed not as new discoveries, but as recovery of ancient wisdom, as revealing what the Apkallis had taught but what had been partially forgotten. This maintained the fiction of unchanging traditional knowledge while allowing for actual development. The temple libraries of Mesopotamia and Egypt preserved vast quantities of written material. At Nippur in Sumer, archaeologists have recovered tens of thousands of tablets, many from the temple library where generations of scribes copied and studied ancient texts. At Nineveh, the library of the Assyrian king, Ashurbanipal contained thousands of tablets systematically collected from across the empire, organised and catalogued with remarkable sophistication. These libraries were understood as repositories of the wisdom that the Apkallis had revealed. Egyptian temple libraries, though less well preserved than their Mesopotamian counterparts because papyrus is more fragile than baked clay, served similar functions. The House of Life attached to major temples functioned as combination scriptoriums, libraries and schools where priests studied sacred texts, copied them, and learned the rituals and knowledge necessary for their religious duties. Access to these libraries was restricted. Not everyone could enter, and not every text could be read by every authorized person. Knowledge was hierarchical, with deeper mysteries reserved for higher initiations. This hierarchical organization of knowledge reflects the belief that some truths are dangerous if misunderstood or misused. The Book of Thoth, according to Egyptian tradition, contained all the knowledge of the gods, but it was so powerful that those who read it unprepared went mad or brought catastrophe upon themselves. Whether such a book actually existed is debatable, but the tradition indicates Egyptian beliefs about the dangerous nature of raw, uncontextualized knowledge. The Mesopotamian equivalent might be the Tablet of Destinies, a mythical object that granted its possessor supreme power over the cosmos. In various myths, the tablet is stolen by rebellious gods or monsters, creating cosmic chaos until it can be recovered. The tablet represents comprehensive knowledge of how reality works, power to command the fundamental forces of existence. Such power couldn't be allowed to fall into the wrong hands, it had to remain with those capable of using it responsibly. These mythical objects, the Book of Thoth and the Tablet of Destinies, symbolize the ancient understanding that knowledge equals power and that power must be wielded carefully. They also suggest that there might be ultimate knowledge, complete understanding of reality, that goes beyond what ordinary humans can safely access. The Watchers possessed such knowledge and shared it inappropriately. The Apkallis possessed it and dispensed it carefully. The Shem-Suhor guarded it in their mystery temples. This brings us to consider the role of initiation in ancient wisdom traditions. Initiation wasn't simply a ceremony or a rite of passage. It represented a fundamental transformation of the initiate's consciousness, a death and rebirth that made them capable of handling knowledge that would be dangerous to unprepared minds. The mystery religions of the ancient world, from the Eleusinian mysteries of Greece to the Isis mysteries of Egypt, all involved initiatory experiences meant to transform participants. These initiations were kept strictly secret. The penalty for revealing the mysteries could be death. What little we know about them comes from fragmentary references, cryptic allusions, and hostile accounts by Christians who condemned them as pagan superstition. But we can determine that they involve dramatic reenactments of mythological narratives, symbolic deaths and resurrections, visions induced through fasting or psychoactive substances, and revelations of secret knowledge. The secrecy wasn't arbitrary. It served multiple functions. Practically, it protected initiates from persecution by those who feared or opposed the mysteries. Psychologically, it intensified the experience, making initiates feel they were part of an exclusive group with access to hidden truth. Spiritually, it reflected the belief that the mysteries couldn't be transmitted through words alone but required direct experience, that telling someone the secrets wouldn't convey understanding, that the transformation had to be undergone personally. The connection to the Watchers, Apkallis and Shem-Suhor, lies in the claim that these mystery traditions preserved knowledge from those primordial teachers. The mysteries of Isis supposedly traced back to Thoth and the ancient wisdom keepers of Egypt. The mysteries of Dionysus and Orpheus in Greece claimed descent from even earlier traditions. All presented themselves as maintaining unbroken lineages of wisdom transmission from the time when gods and humans interacted directly. Whether these claims of ancient lineage were historically accurate is impossible to verify. Institutional continuity over thousands of years is difficult to prove or disprove. What we can say is that the practitioners believed their traditions were ancient. that they were maintaining something precious from the deep past. This belief shaped how they practiced, what they taught, how they understood themselves. The Christian tradition engaged with these pagan mysteries in complex ways. Early Christianity condemned them as demonic deceptions, as false religion leading people away from true worship of God. Church fathers argued that whatever truth the mysteries contained was a corrupted version of revelations that had been given to the Hebrew patriarchs and prophets. The pagan sages and initiates were accessing real spiritual knowledge, but through dangerous intermediaries, demons masquerading as gods. Yet Christianity also absorbed elements from the mystery traditions. The language of rebirth, of dying to the old self and rising as a new creation, parallels the initiatory transformations of the mysteries. The Eucharist, with its emphasis on sacred meal and mystical participation in divine reality, shares structural similarities with mystery cult rituals. The development of Christian monasticism created an alternative initiatory system, with progressive stages of spiritual development leading toward mystical union with God. The tension between revealed religion and esoteric knowledge played out in Christian history through various movements. Gnosticism, which flourished in the early centuries, claimed secret teachings that Jesus had given to his inner circle, knowledge not available to ordinary believers. The mainstream church condemned Gnosticism as heresy, insisting that salvation came through faith accessible to all, not through secret knowledge available only to an elite. But esoteric currents persisted, surfacing in Christian mysticism, in Kabbalah, in Hermeticism, in various occult and magical traditions. These esoteric movements consistently traced their lineage back to primordial sources. Hermeticism claimed descent from Hermes Trismegistus, identified with the Egyptian Thoth, who was himself sometimes identified with the antediluvian patriarch Enoch. The Corpus Hermeticum, a collection of philosophical and magical texts from late antiquity, presents dialogues between Hermes and his disciples, revealing the secrets of nature and divinity. These texts were believed in the Renaissance to be incredibly ancient, predating Moses and preserving wisdom from before the flood. When Renaissance humanists gained access to the Corpus Hermeticum through Greek manuscripts brought from Byzantium, they were electrified. Here was proof that ancient wisdom existed outside the biblical tradition, that pagan philosophers had accessed divine truth through natural reason and mystical experience. Figures like Marsilio Ficino and Pico della Mirandola attempted to synthesize Christian theology with Hermetic philosophy, creating a Christian esotericism that honored both revelation and ancient wisdom. The bubble burst when Isaac Casaubon demonstrated through philological analysis that the Hermetic texts weren't ancient at all, but dated from the early Christian era. They couldn't be preserving pre-flood wisdom because they showed clear influence from Platonic and Christian ideas that post-dated them by centuries or millennia. This didn't entirely destroy interest in Hermeticism, but it undermined the historical claims about ancient lineage that had made the text seem so authoritative. This pattern repeats throughout esoteric history. Claims of ancient origins, when investigated, often turn out to be later inventions or reconstructions. The Egyptian mysteries as practiced in the Roman Empire bore only superficial resemblance to actual ancient Egyptian religion. The Druidic wisdom that modern neo-pagans claim to follow was largely reconstructed in the 18th and 19th centuries, with minimal connection to actual Celtic practices. The Kabbalah, while genuinely Jewish, didn't emerge in the form we recognize until medieval Spain, whatever earlier roots it might claim. Does this mean all esoteric traditions are fraudulent, that there's no genuine ancient wisdom being preserved? Not necessarily. It means that traditions evolve, that they reconstruct themselves according to contemporary needs, while claiming continuity with the past. The substance of what's taught might have value independent of whether the claimed historical lineage is accurate. A practice or teaching doesn't need to be literally ancient to be spiritually or philosophically valuable, but it does affect how we evaluate claims about the Watchers, Apkallis, and Shemsu Hor. If we can't trust claims of unbroken transmission from ancient times in better documented cases, we should be skeptical about claims regarding much more ancient and poorly documented periods. The traditions about antediluvian sages teaching humanity might preserve genuine historical memories, or they might be ancient constructions that were already mythological when first written down. What we can affirm is that something significant happened in human history that led to the relatively rapid development of civilization in multiple locations around the same time, whether we explain this through independent development, through diffusion from a single source, through preserved knowledge from an earlier advanced culture, or through teaching. By supernatural beings, the fact of the development itself is incontestable. Humans went from scattered hunter-gatherer bands to sophisticated urban civilizations in a remarkably short time. The development wasn't uniform across the globe. Some regions developed complex societies early. Others remained at simpler technological and organizational levels for millennia longer. This uneven development might support the diffusionist theories that suggest knowledge spread from central sources rather than being independently invented everywhere. Or it might reflect local conditions, resource availability, population density, and other factors that mainstream archaeology emphasizes. The megalithic monuments that appear across the world during the Neolithic and Bronze Ages present particularly intriguing evidence. Massive stone structures, precisely aligned to celestial phenomena, appear in widely separated locations. Stonehenge in Britain, Karnak in France, the pyramids of Egypt, the ziggurats of Mesopotamia, the structures at Baalbek in Lebanon, all demonstrate sophisticated understanding of astronomy, mathematics, and engineering. Some of these sites show evidence of even earlier construction than originally believed, pushing back the dates of advanced building techniques. Were these monuments products of independent innovation, with different cultures developing similar techniques separately? Or do they reflect transmission of knowledge from common sources? The similarities in astronomical alignments are particularly striking. Many megalithic sites align with solstices, equinoxes, or significant stellar positions. Either multiple cultures independently developed sophisticated astronomy and incorporated it into their monuments, or astronomical knowledge was spread by travelers who taught these techniques widely. The question of cultural diffusion versus independent invention has occupied archaeologists for generations. In the early 20th century, hyperdiffusionism was popular, with some scholars arguing that all civilization spread from a single source, usually identified as Egypt. This view has been largely abandoned as archaeological evidence has demonstrated that many innovations occurred independently in different locations. Agriculture, writing, metallurgy, all developed separately in different regions. But rejection of extreme diffusionism doesn't rule out all contact and knowledge transmission between ancient cultures. We know there was trade. Tin from Cornwall reached Bronze Age workshops in the Mediterranean. Lapis lazuli from Afghanistan appears in Sumerian and Egyptian artifacts. Amber from the Baltic travelled to southern Europe. Trade networks spread over vast distances, and ideas travel along with trade goods. A merchant who travels from Sumer to the Indus Valley might share more than merchandise. He might describe architectural techniques, mathematical methods, astronomical observations, so some degree of diffusion certainly occurred. The question is how much, how systematically, and whether it involved conscious transmission of knowledge from a centralized source or merely gradual spread of innovations through casual contact. The ancient traditions about culture-bearing sages suggest systematic teaching by knowledgeable specialists. Modern archaeology tends to emphasize gradual, disorganized transmission through trade and migration. The truth might involve elements of both. Let's return to the figure of Thoth Hermes, who appears in both Egyptian and later Greco-Roman tradition as the god of wisdom, writing, and magic. In Egyptian texts, Thoth is clearly divine, the ibis-headed god who served as scribe of the gods, who invented writing, who measured time, who maintained cosmic order through proper record-keeping. He judged the hearts of the dead, recording the results of the weighing against the feather of Ma'at. He was associated with the moon, with mathematics, with all forms of knowledge. In later Hermetic tradition, Thoth became Hermes Trismegistus, Hermes the Thrice Great, a title suggesting extraordinary wisdom. The Hermetic texts present him as a human sage who achieved divine status through his wisdom, or as a god who took human form to teach humanity. The ambiguity is probably intentional, reflecting the liminal nature of these knowledge-bearing figures who stand between divine and human. The association of Thoth with Hermes made sense within the Hellenistic syncretistic framework that identified deities across cultures. Thoth and Hermes shared attributes, both being associated with knowledge, communication, magic, and mediation between worlds. But the identification also created a bridge between Egyptian wisdom and Greek philosophy, allowing Hellenistic thinkers to access Egyptian traditions through familiar Greek categories. This syncretic tendency appears throughout the Hellenistic and Roman periods as cultures mixed and borrowed from each other. Isis became identified with dozens of other goddesses. Zeus merged with various local sky gods. The boundaries between different religious and philosophical systems blurred as thinkers sought universal truths underlying diverse traditions. In this intellectual climate, the traditions about antediluvian sages could be reinterpreted as describing the same primordial teaching, revealed to different cultures in different forms. Neoplatonism, the philosophical system that dominated late antique thought, attempted just such a synthesis. Neoplatonist philosophers drew on Plato, but also incorporated elements from Aristotle, Stoicism, Pythagoreanism, and various mystical and religious traditions, including Hermeticism. They saw all wisdom as ultimately deriving from the divine intellect, the nous, which was the first emanation from the ineffable One. Human philosophers and sages accessed this divine wisdom through intellectual and mystical ascent, rising through progressive stages of understanding until they achieved union with the divine. In this framework, the Apkallis, Thoth, Hermes, the Hebrew patriarchs, Pythagoras, Plato, all could be understood as having accessed the same divine wisdom through their various methods. The differences in their teachings reflected different ways of expressing universal truth, adapted to different cultural contexts. This universalizing tendency allowed Neoplatonists to honor multiple traditions without seeing them as contradictory, finding the common core beneath surface variations. Christianity, as it became the dominant religion of the late Roman Empire, had to engage with this Neoplatonic synthesis. Some Christian thinkers, particularly in the Eastern Church, incorporated Neoplatonic philosophy into Christian theology. The Cappadocian Fathers, for instance, used Neoplatonic concepts to explain the Trinity and the Incarnation. Pseudo-Dionysius the Areopagite created an elaborate Christian mystical theology structured around Neoplatonic hierarchies of being and knowledge. But other Christian thinkers rejected philosophical wisdom as leading away from the simple truth of the gospel. Augustine, who had been a Neoplatonist before his conversion, ultimately concluded that pagan philosophy, for all its insights, couldn't save. Only divine grace mediated through Christ could rescue humans from sin and death. Philosophical wisdom might prepare the mind, but couldn't transform the soul. This attitude toward knowledge created the foundation for what we might call esoteric or occult traditions. Esoteric, from Greek esoteros meaning inner or within, describes knowledge reserved for the initiated, understanding that isn't available to everyone but requires preparation and qualification. Occult, from Latin occultus meaning hidden or secret, similarly describes knowledge that is deliberately concealed from the profane masses and revealed only to those who have proven themselves worthy. The temple, mysteries of Egypt, the mystery schools of Greece, the initiatory orders of the ancient world all operated on this principle. They claimed to preserve ancient wisdom from the time before, knowledge that had been passed down from divine or semi-divine teachers through carefully maintained lineages. Whether their claims were historically accurate or not, they genuinely believed they possessed truth that ordinary people couldn't access, secrets that required years of study and spiritual preparation to comprehend. The Book of Enoch itself operates as esoteric literature. It claims to reveal secrets that God showed to Enoch, the seventh from Adam, who walked with God and was taken up into heaven without dying. Enoch toured the cosmos, saw the prison of the Watchers, witnessed the punishment awaiting the wicked, learned the movements of the heavenly bodies, understood the structure of reality. This knowledge wasn't for everyone. It was for the righteous, for those who feared God and kept His commandments, for the initiated who could handle uncomfortable truths about the nature of evil and the ongoing spiritual warfare between good and evil forces. Similarly, the wisdom attributed to the Apkallis and Shem-Suhor wasn't public knowledge. It was preserved in temple libraries, guarded by priests, transmitted through carefully controlled training programs. The exorcism rituals, the astronomical observations, the mathematical formulas, the architectural principles, all of this was professional knowledge, requiring years of apprenticeship and study. You couldn't simply walk in off the street and demand to be taught. You had to prove yourself worthy. This creates an interesting tension. On one hand, knowledge is portrayed as a gift from divine beings to humanity, something that should benefit everyone. On the other hand, it's restricted, kept secret, reserved for an elite. The resolution of this tension lies in the belief that knowledge can be dangerous if misused, that not everyone is ready for every truth, that wisdom requires moral and spiritual preparation as well as intellectual capacity. The Watchers in the Book of Enoch illustrate what happens when knowledge is given without proper preparation. Humanity wasn't ready for the arts of war, for cosmetics and vanity, for astrology and magic. These things corrupted them, led them away from righteousness, filled the world with violence. The Watchers' error wasn't in possessing this knowledge themselves, but in revealing it prematurely to unprepared recipients. God had intended to reveal these things gradually, in proper order, at times when humanity could handle them. The Watchers short-circuited this divine pedagogy and caused catastrophe. Modern parallels aren't hard to find. Nuclear weapons represent knowledge that humanity clearly wasn't morally prepared to handle. Genetic engineering raises similar concerns. Artificial intelligence may soon present comparable dilemmas. We keep discovering or inventing capabilities that outpace our wisdom in using them. The ancients worried about the same problem and expressed it through narratives about watchers and forbidden knowledge. Let's turn our attention now to the physical evidence, the texts and artifacts that preserve these traditions. What do we actually have in concrete terms that tells us about the Watchers, Apkallis, and Shem-Suhor? The answer is a fragmentary and often frustrating collection of sources that require careful interpretation and comparison. For the Mesopotamian Apkallu tradition, we have cuneiform texts from various periods. The oldest references appear in Sumerian literature from the 3rd millennium before the Common Era. The tradition continues through Akkadian, Babylonian, and Assyrian texts, evolving and changing over time. We have king lists that mention the antediluvian rulers and their sages. We have ritual texts that invoke the Apkallis for protection and purification. We have reliefs showing Apkallu, figures in temples and palaces. The Sumerian king list exists in multiple copies, none complete, all showing slight variations. The most complete version is the well-blundell prism, a clay prism inscribed with cuneiform text, now housed in the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford. It was created around 2000 before the Common Era, but draws on earlier traditions. The prism lists the kings of Sumer from the beginning of kingship through the Isin dynasty, providing a continuous historical record that the Sumerians themselves believed connected them back to the very origins of civilization. The list begins with the statement that kingship descended from heaven, making clear that this isn't simply political history but sacred history, the story of how divine order manifested in the human world. It then lists 8 kings who ruled before the flood, giving each of them reigns of thousands or tens of thousands of years. After the flood, it states, kingship descended from heaven again, this time to the city of Kish, and lists post-flood dynasties with more reasonable reign lengths, though still often exaggerated compared to normal human lifespans. The astronomical numbers for the antediluvian kings have been interpreted in various ways. Some scholars suggest they represent a different timescale, perhaps lunar months rather than solar years, though this doesn't entirely resolve the problem. Others propose they're symbolic, representing the relative importance or legitimacy of different dynasties. Still others wonder if they might preserve some memory of actual longevity, whether genetic or technological, that was lost after the flood. Tablets describing the Apkallis themselves come from later periods, particularly the first millennium before the Common Era during the Neo-Assyrian and Neo-Babylonian periods. The ritual text known as Bit Meseri, House of the Purification Ritual, lists the 7 antediluvian sages by name and describes their attributes. It's from this text that we get the standard list. Uana, who completed the plans for heaven and earth, Uana Duga, who was endowed with comprehensive intelligence, and so forth. These texts weren't academic exercises. They were practical documents used in actual rituals. Mesopotamian temples and palaces regularly performed purification ceremonies, often at the beginning of the year or when some impurity threatened the cosmic order. These rituals invoke the 7 Apkallis, asking them to bring their purifying power to cleanse the space and restore harmony. Figurines representing the Apkallis were buried in the foundations of buildings to protect them from evil influences. Archaeological excavations have recovered numerous examples of these protective figurines. They come in 3 basic types: fish-cloaked figures with human bodies wearing fish skins like cloaks, with the fish head sitting atop the human head; bird-headed figures with human bodies but the heads of birds of prey; and purely human figures, often bearded, holding ritual objects. All 3 types are attested in Mesopotamian art and architecture, suggesting that the tradition evolved or that different aspects of the Apkallu nature were emphasized at different times or places. The most famous depictions come from the palace of the Assyrian king Ashurnasirpal II at Nimrud, dating to the 9th century before the Common Era. Massive stone reliefs show Apkallu figures, both fish-cloaked and bird-headed, standing with ritual objects. They hold buckets, presumably containing purifying water, and cone-shaped objects whose exact purpose remains debated. Scholars think they might be pine cones used to sprinkle water, or they might represent something else entirely. The Apkallu figures are shown flanking doorways and sacred trees, protecting these liminal or sacred spaces. For the Egyptian Shemsu-Hor, the textual evidence is more fragmentary, but no less intriguing. The Turin Papyrus, also called the Turin Royal, canon, dates to the reign of Rameses II in the 13th century before the Common Era. It's written in hieratic script on papyrus and originally contained a complete list of Egyptian rulers from the beginning of time through the New Kingdom. Unfortunately, it was badly damaged, and large portions are missing or illegible. What survives is tantalizing. The papyrus clearly divides Egyptian history into different periods. The dynastic pharaohs are listed in chronological order with their reign lengths. Before them comes a section that's partially damaged, but apparently lists the Shemsu-Hor, giving a total reign of thousands of years. Before the Shemsu-Hor, the papyrus listed the gods themselves, the Neteru who ruled in the first time. The existence of this papyrus, an official document created for the royal archives, demonstrates that the Egyptians themselves took these traditions seriously, treating pre-dynastic divine rulers as part of their actual history. Manethos Aegyptiaca, written in Greek in the 3rd century before the Common Era, provides a parallel tradition. Manetho was an Egyptian priest from Sebennytos, who had access to temple archives and ancient records. Writing under the patronage of the Greek Ptolemaic rulers of Egypt, he attempted to create a comprehensive history of his country, organizing it into dynasties and providing systematic chronology. His work doesn't survive intact, but later Christian chronographers like Africanus and Eusebius quoted extensively from it, preserving much of its content. According to the fragments, Manetho organized Egyptian history into several major periods. First came the reign of the gods, when beings like Ptah, Ra, Shu, Geb, Osiris, and Horus ruled Egypt directly. This period lasted thousands of years. Next came the reign of the demigods and spirits of the dead, which some scholars identify with the Shemsu-Hor, lasting another several thousand years. Only after these preliminary periods does Manetho begin listing the historical pharaohs we recognize, starting with Menes, who unified Upper and Lower Egypt. Christian chronographers who preserved Manetho's work often dismissed the pre-dynastic periods as pagan nonsense, but they included them anyway because they were part of Manetho's chronology. Some tried to reinterpret the numbers, suggesting they represented months rather than years, or that they should be divided by some factor to make them more reasonable. But Manetho himself apparently took them seriously, presenting them as actual historical periods that preceded the pharaonic dynasties. The Palermo stone, another crucial piece of evidence for pre-dynastic Egypt, is a fragment of a larger stele that once contained a comprehensive record of Egyptian kings and their major achievements. It dates to the 5th dynasty, around 2400 before the Common Era, making it one of the oldest surviving documents of Egyptian history. The stone is called the Palermo stone because the largest surviving fragment is in the Palermo Archaeological Museum, though other pieces are in Cairo and London. Like the Turin papyrus, the Palermo stone begins its royal chronology before the historical dynasties. The surviving portions include references to pre-dynastic rulers and events, though much of this section is too damaged to read clearly. What we can determine is that the Egyptians who created this monument, living during the Old Kingdom when pyramid building was at its height, believed their history extended back through multiple periods before the unification of Egypt, back to times when different types of rulers governed the land. The pyramid texts, inscribed inside pyramids from the 5th and 6th dynasties, contain the oldest substantial body of Egyptian religious literature. These texts, meant to assist the deceased pharaoh in his journey to the afterlife and his transformation into a divine being, are filled with references to the gods, to primordial events, to the structure of the cosmos. They mention the Shemsu-Hor, the followers of Horus, in contexts that suggest they were ritual specialists, priests who performed the sacred rites necessary for the king's resurrection. Some passages describe the Shemsu-Hor purifying the king in the field of reeds, the Egyptian paradise. Others show them as attendants or helpers of the gods themselves. The texts don't explicitly call them pre-dynastic rulers, but they clearly aren't ordinary humans. They occupy an intermediate space between the fully divine and the fully mortal, functioning as bridges between the two realms. When we examine the Book of Enoch, the textual situation becomes even more complex. The work we call First Enoch is actually a compilation of 5 separate books written at different times by different authors. The Book of the Watchers, which contains the narrative about the descent of the angels and the birth of the Nephilim, is one of the oldest sections, probably composed sometime between the 3rd and 2nd centuries before the Common Era. The other sections, including the astronomical book, the dream visions, the Epistle of Enoch, and the similitudes, were added later. The book circulated in Jewish and early Christian communities, but was eventually excluded from the biblical canon by most traditions. The exception is the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, which still considers it scripture. For centuries, the book was known in Europe only through quotations in works by early church fathers. Then, in the 18th century, Scottish explorer James Bruce brought 3 complete copies in Ethiopic translation back from Ethiopia, making the full text available to European scholars for the first time. The discovery of Dead Sea Scrolls fragments in the mid-20th century revolutionized our understanding of Enochic literature. Among the scrolls found in caves near Qumran were portions of several Enochic works, including fragments of the Book of the Watchers in Aramaic, the original language of composition. These fragments, dating from around 2 centuries before the Common Era, confirm that the book was older than many scholars had assumed, and that it circulated widely in Second Temple Judaism. The Dead Sea Scrolls also included fragments of another related work, the Book of Giants, which tells the story from the perspective of the Nephilim themselves. The giants receive ominous dreams that they can't interpret, so they send Mahaweh, one of their number, to consult Enoch. The prophet provides tablets explaining the dreams, which warn of the giants' impending destruction in the flood. The book preserves names of various giants, including Gilgamesh, connecting the biblical Nephilim tradition explicitly to Mesopotamian mythology. The Manichaeans, followers of the prophet Mani, who created a syncretic religion blending elements of Christianity, Zoroastrianism and Buddhism in the 3rd century, of the Common Era, also preserved the Book of Giants. Fragments of Manichaean versions have been found in Central Asia, written in Middle Persian and other languages. Comparing these fragments to the Dead Sea Scrolls versions has allowed scholars to reconstruct substantial portions of the original text. What emerges from all these fragmentary sources is a complex tradition about antediluvian beings who served as intermediaries between heaven and earth, who possessed extraordinary knowledge and power, who taught humanity the arts of civilization, and whose presence ultimately led to the corruption that necessitated the flood. This tradition appears in multiple cultural contexts, with variations in detail but consistency in the basic narrative structure. The scholarly debate about these texts and traditions continues. Some researchers, particularly those working within religious traditions that consider these texts sacred, interpret them as historical accounts, believing that the Watchers, Nephilim, Apkallis, and Shemsu-Hor were real beings who actually existed and interacted with ancient humanity. They point to the consistency of the traditions across cultures as evidence that something significant really happened in the remote past. Other scholars, approaching the material from a more skeptical position, interpret these traditions as mythology, as ancient attempts to explain the origins of civilization and the persistence of evil in the world. They note that every culture has origin myths, that stories about divine or semi-divine culture heroes are universal, that attributing civilization to supernatural teachers is a common way of adding prestige to cultural practices. From this perspective, the Watchers and Apkallis never existed as actual beings, but only as symbolic representations of cultural development. A third position attempts to find middle ground. Perhaps these traditions preserve genuine historical memories, but memories that have been mythologized and distorted over millennia of transmission. Perhaps there were actual knowledge bearers, human teachers from a more advanced culture or civilization, who brought new techniques and understanding to developing societies. Over time, as direct memory faded and the achievements of these teachers seemed increasingly miraculous to later generations who had lost much of the transmitted knowledge, the human teachers were transformed in memory into supernatural beings. This interpretation doesn't require us to believe in angels or demons or divine intervention, only to accept that human history might be more complex than conventional archaeology suggests, that there might have been lost chapters, forgotten civilizations, rises and falls that aren't reflected in the surviving evidence. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, for instance, proposes that a major cosmic event around 11,600 years ago caused catastrophic climate change and possible flooding, potentially destroying an advanced culture and forcing survivors to restart civilization from a much lower technological base. Evidence for this hypothesis remains contested, with mainstream archaeologists generally rejecting it while some geologists and other scientists find it plausible. If something like this occurred, survivors with preserved knowledge would indeed seem godlike to the people they encountered, and they would be remembered in exactly the way the traditions describe as wise beings who brought civilization after a great catastrophe. The linguistic connections between different traditions also deserve attention. The Hebrew word for watchers, Irin, derives from a root meaning to watch or wake, suggesting beings who remain vigilant. The Egyptian netru comes from a root related to watching and guarding. The Sumerian Abgal and Akkadian Apkalu mean wise or sage, emphasizing knowledge rather than vigilance, but the functions overlap. All these beings watch over humanity, guard sacred knowledge, maintain cosmic order. The concept of 7 sages appears across multiple traditions, not just in Mesopotamia. Hindu tradition speaks of the Saptarishi, the 7 great sages who are sons of Brahma and the fathers of humanity. Greek tradition eventually adopted the idea of 7 sages, though in a more humanized form, listing historical or semi-historical figures like Thales and Solon. The number 7 carries symbolic weight, representing completion or perfection in many numbering systems, but the recurrence of 7 sage figures across disparate cultures suggests possible common origin or at least common symbolic structure. The fish symbolism associated with the Mesopotamian Apkallis is particularly intriguing. Fish, because they live in water, were associated with wisdom and with the god Ea, whose realm was the Apsu, the subterranean freshwater ocean. But fish are also liminal creatures, inhabiting a different element than humans, breathing water, instead of air, moving in ways we can't naturally replicate. Hybrid fishmen would represent beings who could operate in multiple realms, who weren't limited to the human element, who could access knowledge from depths we couldn't reach. This symbolism persists. In later Christian tradition, the fish became a symbol of Christ and of Christianity more broadly. The Greek word for fish, ichthys, was used as an acronym for Jesus Christ, Son of God, Saviour. Some esoteric traditions drew explicit connections between Christian fish symbolism and earlier Mesopotamian fish gods and fish sages, suggesting continuity of symbolic meaning across millennia. Whether these connections are historically valid or represent later attempts to find patterns in disparate traditions remains debatable. The bird symbolism that appears alongside fish imagery in later Mesopotamian depictions of Apkallis suggests a different emphasis. Birds fly, inhabiting the air above the earth, able to see from perspectives humans can't access. Bird-headed Apkallis might represent wisdom gained from elevated vantage points, from seeing the big picture, from having a god's eye view of human affairs. They combine human form, grounding them in earthly reality, with avian heads, giving them access to celestial perspective. The tools the Apkallis hold in Mesopotamian reliefs, the bucket and cone, have been subject to extensive interpretation. The bucket clearly relates to water and purification. Water in Mesopotamian thought was fundamentally purifying and life-giving. The Apsu itself was fresh water, distinct from the saltwater ocean that represented chaos. Sprinkling or applying water from the Apsu would cleanse impurity and restore order. The cone might be a pine cone used as an aspergillum, a tool for sprinkling water, or it might represent something else entirely, perhaps a date palm spadix or even a representation of the pineal gland, though this last interpretation is more speculative. What's clear is that these reliefs show the Apkallis performing ritual functions, maintaining cosmic order through proper ceremony. They're not warriors or rulers in these depictions. They're priests, magicians, wise men using knowledge to protect and purify. This matches the textual descriptions of their roles. They taught humans not just practical skills, but also ritual knowledge, the ceremonies necessary to maintain right relationship with the gods and with the cosmic order. In Egyptian iconography, we don't have comparable clear depictions of the Shemsu Hor as a distinct type of being. They appear in texts, but not in the standardized visual language that ancient Egyptians used to represent gods and humans. This might be because they were less distinct, more transitional, harder to visualize in the Egyptian symbolic system. Or it might be because our evidence is incomplete, with crucial depictions lost when temples were destroyed or texts were burned. What we do have are representations of the gods themselves, the Netru who preceded the Shemsu Hor. These divine beings appear throughout Egyptian art, depicted with animal heads or as animals, each god associated with particular symbols and attributes. Thoth appears as an ibis-headed man or as a baboon. Horus appears as a falcon or falcon-headed man. Anubis appears as a jackal. These hybrid forms parallel the fishmen and birdmen of Mesopotamian tradition, representing beings that transcend simple human or animal categories. The persistence of these hybrid forms across both traditions suggests they were attempting to express something difficult to convey in purely human or purely divine terms. These beings were intermediaries, not fitting cleanly into either category. Making them hybrid in appearance reflected their hybrid nature, their in-between status, their ability to move between different levels of reality. Modern interpretations of these hybrid forms range widely. Some see them as purely symbolic, representing attributes of the gods or functions of the sages. Others interpret them literally, believing ancient people actually encountered beings that appeared this way, whether we explain those beings as extraterrestrials, interdimensional entities, or something else entirely. Still others suggest the hybrid forms might represent genetic experiments, attempts to create enhanced humans or human-animal combinations. Though this interpretation requires accepting technological capabilities far beyond what we normally attribute to ancient civilizations, the teaching of forbidden knowledge remains one of the most compelling aspects of these traditions. What made knowledge forbidden? The Book of Enoch is explicit. Certain knowledge is dangerous because it leads to corruption. Teaching warfare creates violence. Teaching vanity creates lust and pride. Teaching magic creates spiritual corruption. The knowledge itself might be neutral, but in the hands of unprepared humans, it becomes destructive. This raises profound questions about the relationship between knowledge and morality, between capability and wisdom. We face similar questions today with technologies that expand human power without necessarily expanding human wisdom. Nuclear weapons give us the power to destroy civilization, but possessing them doesn't make us wise enough to handle that power responsibly. Genetic engineering gives us the power to modify the human genome, but should we exercise that power without understanding all the consequences? The ancients wrestled with the same dilemmas and expressed their concerns through narratives about watchers who taught too much too soon. The solution wasn't to prevent all knowledge transmission. The Apkallis were honored for bringing civilization. The Shemsuhor were revered for preserving sacred wisdom. But the knowledge had to be transmitted properly, with appropriate preparation to qualified recipients who understood both the power and the responsibility that came with understanding. This created the mystery tradition, the system of initiation and gradual revelation that characterized ancient wisdom schools. You didn't learn everything at once. You were tested, trained, gradually allowed deeper into the mysteries as you proved yourself capable of handling what you learned. Knowledge was organized hierarchically, with outer teachings available to anyone but inner teachings reserved for those who had demonstrated readiness. The Christian tradition inherited this pattern and modified it. Jesus spoke in parables, teaching the multitudes in stories but explaining the deeper meanings privately to his disciples. He told them, "To you it has been given to know the secrets of the kingdom of heaven, but to them it has not been given." This created tension in Christianity between esoteric and exoteric interpretations, between hidden meanings available only to initiates and plain meanings accessible to all believers. The same tension appears in Islam, where Sufi mysticism represents the esoteric dimension, seeking direct experiential knowledge of divine truth, while mainstream Islamic jurisprudence focuses on outer observance and proper behavior. The Kabbalistic tradition in Judaism serves similar functions, providing frameworks for understanding hidden dimensions of Torah and reality that aren't apparent in surface readings. All these esoteric traditions trace their lineage back, directly or indirectly, to those ancient wisdom keepers, to the Watchers and Apkallis and Shemsuhor who first taught humanity the arts of civilization. Whether those beings were angels, advanced humans, or symbolic representations, the traditions they supposedly established shaped how generations of seekers pursued truth and wisdom. Let's examine more closely what happened after the flood in these traditions. In Mesopotamian sources, the Apkallis don't reappear in post-flood history, at least not in their original form. Instead, we get the Umanu, human sages who were trained in the wisdom traditions the Apkallis had established. These post-flood sages served kings as counselors and advisors, but they lacked the supernatural attributes of their predecessors. They were mortal, fully human, products of study and training rather than direct divine creation. The transition from Apkallu to Umanu represents a fundamental shift in how wisdom was accessed and transmitted. In the antediluvian age, wisdom came directly from supernatural sources, from beings who possessed it inherently. After the flood, wisdom became a matter of education, of learning from texts and teachers, of mastering traditional knowledge that had been codified and preserved. The direct pipeline from the divine realm was closed. Humans had to work with what had been left behind. This mirrors the biblical narrative in interesting ways. Before the flood, people lived for centuries and had direct access to knowledge from long-lived patriarchs who remembered earlier times. After the flood, lifespans decreased dramatically, and knowledge had to be transmitted through shorter-lived generations. The ease of direct knowledge transfer was replaced by the difficulty of maintaining traditions across multiple generations who each had limited time to learn and teach. Egyptian tradition shows a similar pattern, though expressed differently. The Neteru ruled directly, then the Shemsu Hor ruled as semi-divine intermediaries, then finally mortal pharaohs ruled claiming descent from or connection to the divine line. Each transition moved further from direct divine presence. The pharaohs performed rituals meant to connect them to the gods, to briefly become Horus incarnate, but they were fully aware they weren't actually gods in the way the Neteru had been. The ritual systems of both Egypt and Mesopotamia can be understood as attempts to maintain connection to the divine in the absence of direct divine presence. Rituals reenacted primordial events, symbolically bringing the past into the present. Proper performance of ritual allowed humans to access, however briefly and incompletely, the power and knowledge that had been more freely available in earlier ages. It was a way of keeping alive the connection to the Watchers and their wisdom, even though they were no longer physically present. This understanding of ritual as technology for accessing knowledge, otherwise unavailable, shapes much of ancient religious practice. The rituals weren't empty ceremonies or superstitious mumbo-jumbo. They were sophisticated systems developed over centuries to achieve specific results, to maintain cosmic order, to connect with spiritual realities, to preserve and transmit wisdom from age to age. When we dismiss ancient ritual as primitive or irrational, we might be missing something crucial. The ancients weren't less intelligent than we are. They simply operated with different paradigms, different assumptions about how reality worked. Within those paradigms, their ritual practices made perfect sense and achieved the goals they were designed to achieve. We might not accept their worldview, but we should at least try to understand it on its own terms. The relationship between the Mesopotamian and Egyptian traditions becomes even more interesting when we consider the third millennium before the Common Era, when both civilizations were developing rapidly. Trade connections existed, diplomatic contacts occurred, ideas flowed back and forth along with trade goods. The two civilizations were aware of each other and influenced each other in various ways. Some scholars have proposed that both drew from a common earlier source, a hypothetical advanced civilization that existed before the Younger Dryas catastrophe, and that seeded multiple regions with knowledge and techniques. This would explain the similarities in their traditions about pre-dynastic or antediluvian culture bearers. Both would be remembering the same events through different cultural lenses. Evidence for such a shared source remains elusive and controversial. We have no unambiguous artifacts from a pre-Younger Dryas advanced civilization. The megalithic structures that some researchers point to as evidence generally can be explained within conventional archaeological frameworks, though some dating and construction mysteries remain unresolved. The flood myths found in cultures worldwide might reflect genuine memories of catastrophic flooding at the end of the Ice Age, but they might also reflect the universal human experience of floods as destructive forces. What we can say with confidence is that both the Mesopotamian and Egyptian traditions preserved remarkably sophisticated knowledge from very early periods. The astronomical observations recorded in their texts, the mathematical techniques used in their monuments, the engineering capabilities demonstrated in their construction projects, all suggest levels of understanding that developed remarkably quickly if we accept conventional chronologies. Whether this rapid development resulted from indigenous innovation, from preserved knowledge from earlier times, or from instruction by mysterious teachers, the fact remains that both civilizations achieved impressive sophistication very early in their documented histories. The astronomical knowledge embedded in ancient structures is particularly striking. The Great Pyramid at Giza aligns with true north to within a fraction of a degree. Its dimensions encode mathematical relationships like pi and phi. Its orientation relates to specific stars. Similar sophisticated astronomical alignments appear in megalithic structures worldwide. Either this knowledge developed independently multiple times, or it was transmitted from common sources, or it represents inheritance from an earlier sophisticated culture. The same astronomical sophistication appears in the Mesopotamian tradition. The Sumerians developed a sophisticated number system based on 60 that we still use for measuring time and angles. They tracked the movements of planets and stars with remarkable accuracy. They developed mathematical techniques for predicting celestial events. The Enuma Anu Enlil, a massive compendium of astronomical omens, demonstrates observational astronomy conducted over centuries if not millennia. Where did this knowledge come from? The orthodox answer is patient observation over generations, with knowledge accumulating as priests and scribes recorded what they saw and recognized patterns. This explanation works for much of what we find, but it seems inadequate for some of the more sophisticated elements, particularly in the earliest periods. It's as if the Sumerians and Egyptians hit the ground running, already possessing knowledge that should have taken longer to develop. The Apkallu and Shemsu-Hor traditions provide an alternative explanation. If wise beings taught astronomy to early humans, that would explain the seemingly precocious sophistication. It would also explain why both traditions credit their astronomical knowledge to divine or semi-divine sources rather than claiming to have developed it through their own efforts. They were being honest about the origins of their knowledge according to their own understanding. Whether we accept supernatural teachers or prefer naturalistic explanations, the traditions themselves are clear. The ancients believed their knowledge came from external sources, from beings who possessed understanding beyond normal human capabilities. They preserved this belief in texts, monuments, and rituals, passing it down through generations, and the consistency of these traditions across cultures suggests something significant underlies them, even if we disagree about what exactly that something is. The concept of the Nephilim, the giant offspring of the Watchers, adds another dimension to these traditions. Giants appear in myths worldwide. Norse tradition has the Jotun. Greek mythology features the Titans and the Gigantes. Hindu texts describe various races of giants. Even Native American traditions preserve stories of giant beings who preceded current humanity. Are all these independent inventions, or do they point to something real? Physical evidence for actual giants remains contentious. Reports of giant skeletons discovered in the 19th and early 20th centuries typically turn out to be exaggerated, misidentified, or outright hoaxes. No verified skeletal remains of humans substantially larger than the largest recorded modern humans have been authenticated. The Smithsonian and other institutions that supposedly suppressed evidence of giants in order to protect evolutionary theory haven't actually done so, as conspiracy theories claim. However, we do have evidence for human populations that were taller than average. The Anakim mentioned in the Hebrew Bible as terrifying, the Israelite spies might have been descendants of unusually tall populations that existed in Canaan. Goliath, the Philistine champion killed by David, is described as over 9 feet tall, which would be extraordinary but not impossible. The biblical text describes other giants in Canaan and the surrounding regions, suggesting populations characterized by unusual height. Gigantism as a medical condition can produce individuals of exceptional height, though usually with health problems that limit lifespan and vigor. If such individuals were common enough in certain populations to be perceived as a distinct race, that might explain the biblical and other ancient references to giants. But the Nephilim of Enochic tradition were supposedly 300 cubits tall, which would make them over 400 feet high. No human body could support that size. This must be symbolic, or represent corruption in transmission or translation. The Book of Giants, preserved in the Dead Sea, scrolls and in Manichaean sources provides the giants' own perspective. They experience ominous dreams that they can't interpret. They feel impending doom. One giant, Mahaway, is sent to consult Enoch, travelling a great distance to find him. Enoch provides tablets explaining that the giants are doomed to destroy each other and be destroyed by the flood as punishment for their father's transgression. The giants debate how to respond. Some repent, others rebel further. All are ultimately destroyed. This narrative humanizes the giants to some degree. They're not just monsters, they're sentient beings caught up in consequences of choices they didn't make, punished for their nature rather than their actions. It adds tragedy to the story. The giants didn't ask to be born from the union of watchers and human women. They didn't choose their hybrid nature, yet they're condemned because their very existence violates the proper boundaries between celestial and terrestrial realms. The theological implications are complex. If the Nephilim were destroyed for simply being what they were born as, how is that just? The text attempts to resolve this by describing them as violent and destructive, consuming humanity and each other, filling the earth with bloodshed. Their nature inevitably produced evil actions. They couldn't help being what they were, but what they were was incompatible with God's plan for creation. The flood was necessary not as punishment, but as cleansing, as removal of corruption that threatened to destroy everything. This resonates with later Christian theology about original sin and the corruption of human nature. If all humans inherit a sinful nature from Adam, are they responsible for sins that flow from that nature? The tradition wrestles with questions of culpability, responsibility, justice, and mercy. The giants become symbols for the broader problem of inherited corruption and the difficulty of determining where responsibility lies when nature and nurture, choice, and compulsion intermingle. The survival of Nephilim after the flood, mentioned in Numbers when the Israelite spies report seeing giants in Canaan, creates interpretive difficulties. If the flood destroyed all the Nephilim, how could they reappear afterward? The text says the Watchers continued their activities after the flood, producing new giants. Others suggest that some Nephilim survived the flood by various means. The tradition about Og of Bashan surviving by riding on top of Noah's Ark appears in rabbinic literature as an attempt to explain post-flood giants. A simpler explanation is that Nephilim in the Numbers passage doesn't refer to literal descendants of the antediluvian giants but simply means tall people, giants in a general sense. The Israelite spies, terrified by the size and strength of the Canaanites, compared them to the legendary Nephilim of old. This would make it hyperbole rather than literal identification. The Anakim and other tall peoples of Canaan were impressive enough to inspire comparisons to the giants of myth, without actually being hybrids of angels and humans. The question of how much of this tradition is meant literally versus how much is symbolic, metaphorical, or mythological remains contested. Ancient authors probably didn't make the same sharp distinction between literal and symbolic that modern readers expect. A story could be both historical and symbolic, conveying truth through narrative that wasn't necessarily factually accurate in every detail. The point was the meaning, the lesson, the theological or moral truth being communicated. We should probably approach these texts with similar flexibility. They preserve ancient traditions about beings who served as culture bearers and knowledge transmitters. Whether those beings were angels, advanced humans, symbolic representations of cultural development, or something else entirely might matter less than what the traditions teach us about how ancient peoples understood knowledge, civilization, morality, and the relationship between human and divine. The influence of these traditions on later religious and esoteric thought is profound. The Book of Enoch, though not canonical in most Christian traditions, was extensively quoted by early church fathers and shaped early Christian angelology and demonology. The notion that demons are disembodied spirits of the destroyed Nephilim provided an origin story for evil spirits that elaborated on the sparse biblical references. The idea of fallen angels who rebelled against God and corrupted humanity became central to Christian cosmology. Islamic tradition also engaged with these narratives. The Quran mentions the jinn, beings created from smokeless fire who have free will and can be righteous or wicked. Some Islamic scholars connected the jinn to the Watchers tradition, suggesting parallels between jinn who tempted or corrupted humans and the angels who descended to earth and took human wives. The prophet Idris, usually identified with Enoch, holds an honored position in Islamic tradition as one who was taken up by God without experiencing death. Medieval Jewish mysticism, particularly Kabbalah, incorporated traditions about the Watchers and Nephilim into complex cosmologies of angelic hierarchies and demonic forces. The Zohar and other Kabbalistic texts describe multiple levels of reality, with beings operating at different levels. The Watchers who descended represent a breach of these levels, a transgression of proper boundaries. Their punishment, binding in the earth until the final judgment, reflects the necessity of maintaining the integrity of different levels of existence. Christian Gnosticism, flourishing in the first few centuries of the Common Era before being suppressed as heretical, developed elaborate myths involving archons, demiurges, and various classes of spiritual beings. These myths drew on Enochian traditions, reinterpreting them through Gnostic frameworks that saw the material world as a prison created by ignorant or evil spiritual powers. The Watchers became archons who trap human souls in matter. The knowledge they brought, however, could be reinterpreted as gnosis, saving knowledge that allows souls to escape the material prison. The esoteric traditions of the Renaissance and Enlightenment periods drew heavily on these older sources. Hermetic philosophy, claiming descent from the wisdom of Thoth Hermes, presented systems of magic and spiritual development that supposedly traced back to the antediluvian sages. Alchemists sought the prima materia and the philosopher's stone using techniques they claimed had been revealed by angels to the antediluvian patriarchs. Freemasonry and other initiatory orders developed elaborate mythologies connecting their traditions to the builders of Solomon's temple, the mystery schools of Egypt and Greece, and ultimately to the wisdom brought by the Apkallis and Shemsu-Hor. Whether these historical connections were authentic or invented, they demonstrate the persistent appeal of the idea that true wisdom comes from an ancient lineage of initiates who preserve secrets from the time before the flood. Modern esoteric movements continue this pattern. Theosophy, founded in the 19th century, presented elaborate cosmologies involving root races, ascended masters, and ancient wisdom that supposedly descended from Atlantis and Lemuria. The ascended master teachings, channeled messages from spiritual beings, claim connection to ancient wisdom keepers. New Age movements frequently reference ancient astronauts, Atlantean technology, and forgotten civilizations, repackaging old traditions in modern language. The ancient astronaut theory, popularized by Erich von Däniken and Zecharia Sitchin in the late 20th century, reinterprets the Watchers, Apkallis and Neteru as extraterrestrial visitors who came to Earth in the distant past and influenced human development. This theory takes the texts at face value regarding the existence of the beings described but naturalizes them, transforming angels into aliens, divine powers into advanced technology, spiritual knowledge into scientific understanding. Sitchin's work in particular developed elaborate interpretations of Sumerian texts, claiming that the Anunnaki were extraterrestrials from a planet called Nibiru who came to Earth to mine gold and genetically engineered humans as a slave species. Mainstream scholars of Sumerian language and culture have thoroughly debunked Sitchin's translations and interpretations, pointing out that he consistently mistranslated words, took passages out of context and imposed modern concepts onto ancient texts that don't support his readings. Nevertheless, his book sold millions of copies and influenced countless people. The appeal is understandable. The ancient astronaut theory provides a naturalistic explanation for traditions that otherwise seem to require supernatural interpretation. It maintains the basic narrative structure of advanced beings teaching primitive humans while removing the religious and theological elements that modern secular minds might find difficult to accept. It also appeals to the science fiction sensibilities of contemporary culture, fitting ancient myths into a framework of space travel and genetic engineering. Whether the ancient astronaut theory is true is less relevant for our purposes than recognizing how it represents another chapter in the long history of interpreting traditions about the Watchers and their kin. Every generation reinterprets these stories through its own cultural lens, finding in them reflections of contemporary concerns and contemporary paradigms. Medieval Christians saw them as warnings about consorting with demons. Renaissance Hermeticists saw them as evidence of ancient wisdom. Modern UFO enthusiasts see them as records of alien contact. The malleability of these traditions, their ability to be reinterpreted across millennia without losing their essential character, suggests they touch something fundamental in human psychology or human history. Perhaps we're hardwired to imagine wise teachers from beyond who give us knowledge we couldn't develop on our own. Perhaps there really were such teachers, whether divine, extraterrestrial, or simply from a lost human civilization. Perhaps the stories evolved from dimly remembered actual events that have been mythologized beyond recognition. What we can say is that these traditions mattered immensely to the people who preserved them. The Sumerians carved them into cuneiform tablets and placed protective apakalu figurines in the foundations of their buildings. The Egyptians recorded them in papyrus king lists and pyramid texts. The Jews incorporated them into their sacred literature. These weren't idle stories told for entertainment. They were serious attempts to understand the origins of civilization and the nature of knowledge itself. In our own time, as we grapple with questions about human enhancement, artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, and the ethical implications of new technologies, these ancient stories about forbidden knowledge and the consequences of premature revelations speak to us with renewed relevance. We face similar questions to those the ancients wrestled with. How much knowledge is too much? Who should have access to potentially dangerous information? What are the ethical boundaries of scientific research and technological development? The Watchers transgressed by teaching too much too soon. We might be transgressing by developing capabilities that outpace our wisdom in using them. The ancients expressed their concerns through mythological narratives. We express ours through ethical debates and regulations. But the underlying issue remains the same. Knowledge is power, and power without wisdom is dangerous. Perhaps that's the ultimate lesson of these traditions. Not whether the Watchers were real angels, or the Apkallis were real fishmen, or the Shemsu Hor were real semi-divine rulers, but rather that knowledge must be accompanied by wisdom, that power requires responsibility, that advancing civilization isn't just about accumulating capabilities, but about developing the moral and spiritual maturity to use those capabilities well. The Mesopotamian tradition honored the Apkallis as culture bearers, but also recognized their dangerous aspects. The Egyptian tradition revered the Shemsu Hor as wisdom keepers, but acknowledged that their knowledge had to be carefully guarded and transmitted. The Enochian tradition condemned the Watchers as transgressors, but preserved their story as a warning. All three traditions grappled with the double-edged nature of knowledge, its capacity to enlighten and to corrupt. As we stand on the threshold of new ages ourselves, developing technologies that would seem magical to our ancestors, perhaps we should pay attention to what these ancient traditions tried to teach. The beings who brought civilization, whether we call them Watchers, Apkallis, or Shemsu Hor, whether we interpret them as angels, aliens, or advanced humans, left behind not just knowledge but a warning. Knowledge without wisdom leads to catastrophe. Power without responsibility leads to destruction. Advancement without moral development leads to the necessity for cleansing, for starting over, for learning the hard lessons again. Our contemporary world faces dilemmas that directly parallel the concerns expressed in these ancient texts. Consider artificial intelligence, which we're developing at breathtaking speed with insufficient consideration of the consequences. We're creating systems that might eventually surpass human intelligence, that might make decisions we can't understand or control, that might reshape society in ways we haven't begun to anticipate. We're teaching machines arts and capabilities without ensuring they have the wisdom or values to use those capabilities responsibly. Sound familiar? The Watchers taught humanity forbidden arts without ensuring humans were ready for them. We're teaching machines advanced capabilities without ensuring they're ready, or that we're ready for the consequences. The ancient texts describe the result as catastrophic corruption, requiring divine intervention to cleanse. We might face similar consequences if we continue developing AI without adequate safeguards and ethical frameworks. The form is different, but the structure of the problem is identical. Genetic engineering presents similar concerns. We can now edit the human genome with unprecedented precision. We can eliminate genetic diseases, enhance capabilities, potentially redesign the human form itself. But should we? The Watchers produced the Nephilim through transgressive unions that violated the boundaries between heaven and earth. We might produce our own, hybrid creations through genetic engineering that violates natural boundaries. The ancients saw the destruction of the Nephilim as tragic but necessary. What might be necessary if we create beings through genetic manipulation that we can't control or that threaten the integrity of natural human development? Nuclear weapons, which we've possessed for almost 80 years now, demonstrate that the ancient concerns about forbidden knowledge remain profoundly relevant. We developed the capability to destroy human civilization, and we've managed so far not to use it catastrophically, but the threat persists. Every generation that inherits nuclear arsenals must relearn the wisdom of restraint. The knowledge of how to build nuclear weapons can't be unlearned. It's out in the world permanently. All we can do is maintain the moral and political frameworks that prevent their use. This is precisely the situation the ancient wisdom traditions warned about. Some knowledge, once revealed, can't be hidden again. The Watchers' teachings about metallurgy and warfare couldn't be forgotten once given. The genie, once out of the bottle, stays out. Our modern technologies follow the same pattern. We can't uninvent nuclear weapons or artificial intelligence or genetic engineering. All we can do is develop the wisdom to handle what we've learned to do. The ancient solution was initiatory training, carefully controlled transmission of knowledge only to those who had proven themselves worthy through moral and spiritual development. We attempt something similar with security clearances, professional licensing, ethical review boards, regulatory frameworks. But these modern equivalents are far less rigorous than ancient initiations. We allow people to pursue dangerous knowledge and develop dangerous capabilities with minimal demonstration that they possess the wisdom to use them well. Modern education focuses almost exclusively on capability development, on teaching people how to do things. We teach engineering, science, mathematics, technology, all focused on expanding human power. We teach much less about wisdom, about moral development, about the proper use of knowledge and capability. Ethics courses exist, but they're often peripheral, not central to education. We produce technically sophisticated graduates who may lack the moral and philosophical frameworks to understand their responsibilities. This represents a fundamental shift from ancient education, which integrated technical training with moral and spiritual development. You couldn't advance in the Egyptian or Mesopotamian scribal schools without demonstrating not just competence, but character. The knowledge you received was understood as sacred trust, and you had to prove yourself worthy of that trust. We've largely abandoned this integrated approach, separating technical education from moral formation, and we're experiencing the consequences. The tech industry provides numerous examples. Brilliant engineers and entrepreneurs develop powerful technologies without adequate consideration of their social implications. Social media platforms designed to connect people instead fragment communities and spread misinformation. Algorithms optimized for engagement instead promote outrage and division. Data collection systems designed for convenience instead enable surveillance and manipulation. The creators of these systems weren't malicious. They were highly capable people who lacked the wisdom to anticipate and prevent harmful applications of their creations. The transhumanist movement, which advocates using technology to fundamentally enhance human capabilities beyond current natural limits, exemplifies both the promise and the peril of the ancient concern about knowledge and transformation. Transhumanists envision using genetic engineering, cybernetic enhancement, artificial intelligence integration, and other technologies to create post-human beings with vastly expanded capabilities. They see this as the next stage of human evolution, a desirable outcome to be actively pursued. Critics of transhumanism point out that this is exactly what the tradition warns against, attempting to transcend human limitations without the wisdom to handle the transcendence. The Watchers tried to bridge the gap between divine and human, producing the Nephilim, who became monsters. We might produce our own monsters if we pursue transhuman enhancement without adequate consideration of the consequences. What happens to human society if some people are radically enhanced while others aren't? What happens to human identity and dignity if we can be upgraded like machines? What happens to mortality, meaning, and purpose if we achieve radical life extension or functional immortality? These aren't idle questions. They're urgent concerns that our civilization must address as these technologies become increasingly feasible. The ancient texts provide no clear answers, but they provide a framework for thinking about the questions. They remind us that knowledge and power without wisdom lead to catastrophe. They suggest that certain boundaries exist for good reasons, that transgressing them, even with good intentions, can produce terrible outcomes. They warn that playing God without being God produces chaos rather than order. The ecological crisis facing our world provides another parallel to ancient concerns. Human technological development has given us unprecedented power over nature, power to reshape ecosystems, alter the climate, drive species to extinction. We've used this power without sufficient wisdom, pursuing short-term benefits without adequately considering long-term consequences. The result is environmental degradation that threatens the stability of the systems that support human civilization. The Mesopotamian tradition spoke of the Apkallis teaching humanity agriculture, irrigation, and other techniques for exploiting natural resources. These were beneficial gifts that enabled civilization. But unwise use of these techniques led to salinization of fields, deforestation, erosion, the environmental degradation that contributed to the collapse of various Mesopotamian civilizations. Knowledge of how to use nature didn't include wisdom about sustainable use, about limits, about long-term stewardship. Similarly, our modern knowledge of chemistry, physics, biology, and engineering has given us extraordinary power to exploit natural resources. We've used this power to create unprecedented prosperity for billions of people. But we've done so in ways that are demonstrably unsustainable, that are degrading the systems that make continued prosperity possible. We have the knowledge to use nature effectively. We lack the wisdom to use it sustainably. The solution isn't to abandon knowledge or technology, to return to some imagined primitive simplicity. That's neither possible nor desirable. The solution is to develop wisdom commensurate with our knowledge, to integrate moral and ecological understanding with technical capability, to use our power responsibly rather than recklessly. This is exactly what the ancient traditions about the Apkallis and Shemsu-Hor taught. They brought knowledge, but they insisted it be used properly, that it be embedded in systems of meaning and value that prevented its misuse. The persistence of these ancient traditions across millennia suggests they address something fundamental about the human condition. Every generation faces the challenge of handling knowledge wisely. Every society must develop systems for ensuring that power is used responsibly. Every civilization must find ways to transmit not just technical knowledge but wisdom, not just capability but character. The forms change, the specific challenges differ, but the underlying structure remains constant. The modern rediscovery and reinterpretation of these traditions demonstrates their continued relevance, whether approached through academic scholarship, religious devotion, esoteric practice, or alternative history. People continue finding meaning in stories about the Watchers and their kin. These stories speak to enduring concerns about human origins, human potential, human limitations, and human responsibilities. They provide frameworks for thinking about knowledge, power, wisdom, and the proper ordering of human society. The scholarly study of these texts continues to reveal new dimensions. Archaeological discoveries provide new evidence that requires reinterpreting old assumptions. Linguistic analysis uncovers connections between traditions that weren't previously recognized. Comparative mythology identifies patterns that might reflect either common origins or universal human concerns. Each generation of scholars brings new methods and perspectives to these ancient materials, finding in them things previous scholars missed. The Dead Sea Scrolls discovery in the mid-20th century revolutionized our understanding of Enochian literature and its place in Second Temple Judaism. Before the scrolls were found, most scholars assumed the Book of Enoch was a marginal text, a piece of apocalyptic speculation that mainstream Judaism had rejected. The discovery that multiple copies of Enochic works existed at Qumran, that they were studied and copied alongside biblical texts, demonstrated that Enochic traditions were far more central to certain Jewish groups than previously believed. This discovery has implications for how we understand the development of Jewish and Christian thought. The idea of fallen angels who corrupted humanity, which is central to a Sikh tradition but barely mentioned in the canonical Hebrew Bible, clearly influenced New Testament writers and early church fathers. The demonology of Christianity, the concept of spiritual warfare between good and evil forces, the notion that demons are fallen angels rather than just impersonal evil forces, all derive more from Enochic tradition than from the canonical Old Testament. Similarly, recent archaeological work on the Sumerian king list and related cuneiform texts has refined our understanding of how Mesopotamians conceived the relationship between divine and human kingship. The discovery of new fragments, the ability to compare multiple versions, the application of sophisticated textual analysis all contribute to a more nuanced understanding than earlier scholars possessed. We now recognize that the tradition evolved over time, that different versions emphasize different aspects, that what seems like a simple list of antediluvian kings actually represents complex theological claims about the nature of legitimate rule. Egyptian archaeology continues to surprise us with new discoveries that might relate to the traditions about the Shemsu-Hor. Recent work at sites like Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, though not Egyptian, has demonstrated that sophisticated megalithic construction occurred far earlier than previously believed, in some cases predating conventional estimates for the beginning of civilization by thousands of years. This has reopened questions about whether there might have been advanced cultures in the pre-dynastic period that conventional chronology hasn't recognized. The dating of the Sphinx remains contentious. Geologist Robert Schoch has argued based on erosion patterns that the Sphinx is much older than Egyptologists believe, potentially dating to a period of higher rainfall before the dynastic period began. Mainstream Egyptologists reject this analysis, arguing that the erosion can be explained without invoking extreme age. But the debate illustrates that significant questions remain about Egyptian prehistory and about what might have existed before the historical dynasties. If the Sphinx or other monuments do predate the dynasties substantially, this would lend some credence to traditions about the Shemsu-Hor building during the pre-dynastic period. It wouldn't prove they were semi-divine beings, of course, but it would demonstrate that sophisticated civilization existed in Egypt earlier than conventional archaeology accepts, which would at least partially vindicate the ancient Egyptian traditions about pre-dynastic rulers. The modern fascination with ancient mysteries, with alternative histories, with lost civilizations, reflects genuine uncertainty about our past, combined with dissatisfaction with conventional narratives that seem incomplete or inadequate. Mainstream archaeology has made tremendous progress in understanding human prehistory, but significant gaps and questions remain. These gaps leave room for alternative interpretations, for speculation about what might have existed that we haven't yet discovered. Some of this alternative thinking is valuable, raising legitimate questions and highlighting evidence that mainstream scholars might have overlooked or dismissed. Some of it is less rigorous, making claims that far exceed what the evidence actually supports. The challenge is distinguishing between productive speculation and unwarranted speculation, between theories that might be correct and theories that are almost certainly wrong. The traditions about the Watchers, Apkallis, and Shem-Suhor fall into this ambiguous category. They're not proven, but they're not disproven either. They preserve ancient beliefs that might reflect historical realities we don't fully understand, or they might be entirely mythological. Reasonable people can disagree about how to interpret them. What's clear is that they matter, that they've mattered for millennia, that they continue to inspire research, debate, and reflection. The enduring power of these traditions demonstrates something important about human nature. We're storytelling creatures who make sense of our world through narrative. We need origin stories, accounts of where we came from and how we got here. We need to understand ourselves in relation to something larger, whether we call that larger context the divine, the cosmic, or simply the historical. The stories about beings who taught our ancestors civilization provide one framework for understanding our origins and our nature. These stories also speak to our aspirations. We want to believe we can transcend our limitations, that we can become more than we currently are. The Watchers, Apkallis, and Shem-Suhor represent possibilities for transformation, for accessing knowledge and capabilities beyond normal human limits. They're simultaneously warnings about the dangers of such transcendence and examples of what might be possible. In our contemporary world, as we develop technologies that might actually enable some of the transformations that were once purely mythological, these ancient stories gain new relevance. We might actually be able to extend human lifespan dramatically, to enhance human intelligence, to interface with machines, to explore and perhaps colonize other worlds. The question isn't whether transformation is possible, but whether we have the wisdom to navigate transformation without destroying ourselves in the process. The ancient wisdom traditions insist that such wisdom exists, that it can be learned, that it must be learned if we're to use our powers well. They offer, through their various teachings and practices, systems for developing that wisdom. Whether through religious devotion, philosophical study, contemplative practice, or initiatory experience, they claim to provide paths toward the understanding necessary to handle knowledge responsibly. Modern secular society has largely rejected these traditional wisdom paths, believing we can figure things out through reason and science alone. But reason and science give us knowledge and power without necessarily providing the moral and spiritual frameworks to use them well. We might need to reconsider whether the ancients were right, that some form of wisdom training, some systematic development of moral and spiritual capacity, needs to accompany technical education. This doesn't mean we should literally revive ancient mystery cults or adopt religious dogmas uncritically. It means we should take seriously the underlying insight that knowledge without wisdom is dangerous, that capability without character produces harm. We need to develop modern equivalents of the wisdom traditions, frameworks appropriate to our secular, pluralistic, technological society, but serving similar functions to what the ancient initiatory systems provided. Some contemporary movements point in this direction. The emphasis on emotional intelligence in education and business recognizes that technical skill isn't sufficient, that people need to develop self-awareness and interpersonal capabilities. The growing interest in mindfulness and contemplative practices represents an attempt to import wisdom, practices from traditional contexts into modern, secular ones. The development of professional ethics codes and ethical review boards for research attempts to institutionalize moral restraint on the use of knowledge and power. These are positive developments, but they're not yet sufficient to meet the challenge. We need more systematic, more comprehensive, more rigorous approaches to wisdom development. We need to make moral and spiritual formation as central to education as technical training. We need to recognize that the ancients were right, that knowledge is dangerous without wisdom, and that we ignore this truth at our peril. The text we've explored tonight, from the Sumerian king list to the Book of Enoch, from Egyptian papyri to Mesopotamian ritual incantations, all point toward this same fundamental insight. They tell us, in their various ways, that humanity received the gifts of civilization from beings greater than ourselves, that these gifts came with responsibilities and warnings, that using knowledge without wisdom leads to catastrophe. Whether those beings were literally real or metaphorically true matters less than heeding the warning they embody. As we close our journey through these ancient traditions, we're left with questions more than answers. Were the Watchers real beings who descended to Mount Hermon? Were the Apkallis actual fishmen who emerged from the Persian Gulf? Did the Shemsu-Hor rule Egypt before the dynasties? We don't know with certainty, and we may never know. But we know the traditions existed, that they shaped how ancient peoples understood themselves, that they preserved warnings and wisdom that remain relevant today. The texts we've examined tonight, fragmentary and disputed though they may be, preserve this warning across millennia. They connect us to ancient concerns that remain thoroughly modern. They remind us that our ancestors weren't primitive or naive. They wrestled with profound questions about the nature of knowledge, the origins of civilization, and the proper relationship between human and divine, between mortality and transcendence, between the world as it is and the world as it might become. Whether the Watchers descended to Mount Hermon, whether the Apkallis emerged from the Apsu, whether the Shemsu-Hor ruled Egypt in the time before the dynasties, these traditions speak to enduring human questions about where we came from, how we learned what we know, and what responsibilities come with the knowledge and power we possess. They deserve our attention not as historical curiosities, but as living wisdom traditions that continue to illuminate the human condition. The journey through these texts and traditions has taken us from Sumerian cuneiform tablets to Egyptian papyri, from the Book of Enoch to modern archaeological debates. We've encountered fishmen and bird-headed sages, giant offspring of angels and women, semi-divine kings who possessed the wisdom of the gods. We've explored the connections between different cultural traditions and the persistent patterns that appear across time and geography. We've considered multiple interpretations, from the supernatural to the naturalistic, from the historical to the symbolic. What emerges is a rich tradition of human reflection on our origins and our destiny, preserved in texts that have survived against considerable odds through millennia of change and upheaval. These texts mattered enough to their original authors and preservers that they went to enormous effort to maintain them, copy them, protect them from destruction. They matter enough to us that we continue to study them, debate them, reinterpret them for our own times. The mystery of the Watchers who ruled Egypt may never be definitively solved. We may never know with certainty whether the beings described in these texts were real, whether the events narrated actually occurred, whether the knowledge attributed to divine or semi-divine teachers really came from such sources, but the traditions themselves are unquestionably real. They shaped civilizations, influenced religions, guided the development of Western thought, and they continue to speak to us across the vast gulf of time, asking us to consider profound questions about knowledge, wisdom, power, and responsibility. As we close tonight's exploration, I want to thank you for joining me on this journey through ancient texts and timeless mysteries. If you found this fascinating, if it sparked your curiosity, If you want to explore more of history's hidden corners, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support makes it possible for us to continue delving into these remarkable stories that connect us to our deepest past. Leave a comment letting me know what aspect of this topic intrigued you most. Do you think the Watchers were real beings? Do the parallels between Sumerian and Egyptian traditions suggest common origins? What do these ancient warnings about forbidden knowledge mean for our own technological age? I read every comment and love hearing your thoughts and perspectives. Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep your mind open to the mysteries that history continues to reveal. Good night, and may your own journey toward wisdom be guided by both knowledge and understanding.